Section 1 of The Adventures of Master F.J. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Adventures of Master F.J. by George Gascoigne, Section 1. Introductory Note to the Original Edition of 1573, herein designated Q1. The Printer to the Reader. It hath been an old saying, that while two dogs do strive for a bone, the third may come and carry it away. And this proverb may, as I fear, be well verified in me, which take in hand the imprinting of this poetical poesie. For the case seemeth doubtful, and I will disclose my conjecture. Master H.W. in the beginning of this work hath in his letter written to the readers, cunningly discharged himself of any such misliking, as the graver sort of grey-bearded judgers might, perhaps, conceive in the publication of these pleasant pamphlets. And next unto that learned preamble, the letter of G.T., by whom, as seemeth, the first copy hereof was unto the same H.W. delivered, doth with no less clerkly cunning seek to persuade the readers that he also would by no means have it published. Now I fear very much, all these words notwithstanding, that these two gentlemen were of one assent compact to have it imprinted, and yet finding by experience that nothing is so well handled now a days, but that some malicious minds may either take occasion to mislike it themselves, or else find means to make it odious unto others, they have therefore each of them politically prevented the danger of misreport, and suffered me, the poor printer, to run away with the palm of so perilous a victory. Notwithstanding, having well perused the work, I find nothing therein amiss, to my judgment, unless it be 2 or 3 wanton places passed over in the disclose of an amorous enterprise, the which, for as much as the words are cleanly, although the thing meant be somewhat natural, I have thought good also to let them pass as they came to me, and the rather because, as Master H.W. hath well alledged in his letter to the reader, the well-minded man may reap some commodity out of the most frivolous works that are written. And as the venomous spider will suck poison out of the most wholesome herb, and the industrious bee can gather honey out of the most stinking weed, even so the discreet reader may take a happy example by the most lascivious histories, although the captious and harebrained heads can neither be encouraged by the good nor forewarned by the bad. And thus much I have thought good to say in excuse of some savours, which may perchance smell unpleasantly to some noses, in some part of this poetical poesie. Now it hath with this fault a greater commodity than common posies have been accustomed to present, and that is this: you shall not be constrained to smell of the flowers therein contained all at once, neither yet to take them up in such order as they are sorted. But you may take any one flower by itself, and if that smell not so pleasantly as you would wish, I doubt not yet but you may find some other which may supply the defects thereof. As thus, he which would have good moral lessons clerkly handled, let him smell to the tragedy translated out of Euripides. He that would laugh at a pretty conceit closely conveyed, let him peruse the comedy translated out of Ariosto. He that would take example by the unlawful affections of a lover bestowed upon an unconstant dame, let them read the report in verse made by Dan Bartholomew of Bath, or the discourse in prose of the adventures passed by Master F.J., whom the reader may name Freeman Jones, for the better understanding of the same. He that would see any particular pang of love lively displayed, may here approve every pamphlet by the title, and so remain contented. As also divers godly hymns and psalms may in like manner be found in this record. To conclude, the work is so universal, as either in one place or other, any man's mind may therewith be satisfied. The which I adventure, under pretext of this promise, to present unto all indifferent eyes as followeth. End of introductory note. Page 1 of The Adventures of Master F.J. by George Gascoigne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Note: Q1 begins thus. A discourse of the adventures passed by Master F.J. H.W. to the reader. In August last past, my familiar friend Master G.T. bestowed upon me the reading of a written book, wherein he had collected divers discourses and verses, invented upon sundry occasions, by sundry gentlemen, in mine opinion, right commendable for their capacity. And herewithal my said friend charged me, that I should use them only for mine own particular commodity, and eftsoons safely deliver the original copy to him again, wherein I must confesse myself but half a merchant, for the copy unto him I have safely redelivered. But the worke, for I thought it worthy to be published, I have entreated my friend A.B. to imprint, as one that thought better to please a number by common commodity, than to feed the humour of any private person by needless singularity. This I have adventured, for thy contentation, learned reader, and further have presumed of my selfe, to christen it by the name of 100 Sundry Flowers, in which poeticall poesie are set forth many trifling fantasies, humoral passions, and strange affects of a lover, and therein, although the wiser sort would turn over the leaf as a thing altogether fruitless, yet I myself have reaped this commodity, to sit and smile at the fond devices of such as have enchained themselves in the golden fetters of fantasie, and having bewrayed themselves to the whole world, do yet conjecture that they walk unseen in a net. Some other things you may also find in this book, which are as void of vanity, as the first are lame for government. And I must confesse that, what to laugh at the one, and what to learn by the other, I have contrary to the charge of my said friend G.T. procured for these trifles this day of publication. Whereat if the authors only repine, and the number of other learned minds be thankfull, I may then boast to have gained a bushel of good will, in exchange for 1 pint of peevish choler. But if it fall out contrary to expectation, that the readers judgments agree not with mine opinion in their commendations, I may then, unless their courtesies supply my want of discretion, with losse of some labour, account also the losse of my familiar friends, in doubt whereof I cover all our names, and refer you to the well written letter of my friend G.T. next following, whereby you may more at large consider of these occasions. And so I commend the praise of other mens travails, together with the pardon of mine own rashnesse, unto the well willing minds of discreet readers. From my lodging near the Strand, the 20th of January, 1572. H.W. The letter of G.T. to his very friend, H.W. concerning this work. Remembering the late conference passed between us in my lodging, and how you seemed to esteeme some pamphlets which I did then shew unto you far above their worth in skill, I did straightway conclude the same your judgment to proceed of 2 especial causes. One and principal, the steadfast good will, which you have ever hitherto sithens our first familiarity borne towards me. Another, of no lesse weight, the exceeding zeal and favour that you beare to good letters, the which, I agree with you, do not lesse bloom and appear in pleasant ditties or compendious sonnets devised by green youthful capacities, than they do fruitfully flourish unto perfection in the riper workes of grave and gray-haired writers. For as in the last, the younger sort may make a mirror of perfect life, so in the first the most frosty bearded philosopher may take just occasion of honest recreation, not altogether without wholesome lessons, tending to the reformation of manners. For who doubteth but that poets in their most feigned fables and imaginations have metaphorically set forth unto us the right rewards of virtues, and the due punishments for vices? Marry, indeed I may not compare pamphlets unto poems, neither yet may justly advant for our native countrymen, that they have in their verses hitherto, translations excepted, delivered unto us any such notable volume, as have been by poets of antiquity left unto the posterity. And the more pity, that amongst so many toward wits, no one hath been hitherto encouraged to follow the trace of that worthy and famous knight, Sir Geoffrey Chaucer, and after many pretty devises spent in youth, for the obtaining a worthless victory, might consume and consummate his age in describing the right pathway to perfect felicity, with the due preservation of the same. The which, although some may judge over grave, a subject to be handled in style metrical, yet for that I have found in the verses of eloquent Latinists, learned Greeks, and pleasant Italians, sundry directions whereby a man may be guided toward the attaining of that unspeakable treasure. I have thus far lamented that our countrymen have chosen rather to win a Passover praise by the wanton penning of a few loving lays, than to gain immortal fame by the clerkly handling of so profitable a theme. For if quickness of invention, proper vocables, apt epithets, and store of monosyllables may help a pleasant brain to be crowned with laurel, I doubt not but both our countrymen and country language might be enthronized among the old foreleaders unto the Mount Helicon. But now let me return to my first purpose, for I have wandered somewhat beside the path, and yet not clean out of the way. I have thought good, I say, to present you with this written book, wherein you shall find a number of sonnets, lays, letters, ballads, rondelets, verles, and verses, the works of your friend and mine, Master F.J, and divers others, the which when I had with long travail confusedly gathered together, I thought it then opera precium to reduce them into some good order, the which I have done according to my barren skill in this written book, commending it unto you to read and to peruse, and desiring you, as I only do adventure thus to participate the sight thereof unto your former good will, even so that you will by no means make the same common, but after your own recreation taken therein, that you will safely redeliver unto me the original copy. For otherwise I shall not only provoke all the authors to be offended with me, but further shall lose the opportunity of a greater matter, half and more granted unto me already, by the willing consent of one of them. And to be plain with you, my friend, he hath written, which as far as I can learn, did never yet come to the reading or perusing of any man but himself, two notable works, the one called The Sundry Lots of Love, the other of his own invention entitled The Climbing of an Eagle's Nest. These things, and especially the latter, doth seem by the name to be a work worthy the reading, and the rather I judge so, because his phantasy is so occupied in the same, as that contrary to his wonted use, he hath hitherto withheld it from sight of any his familiars, until it is finished, you may guess him by his nature. And therefore I require your secrecy herein, lest if he hear the contrary, we shall not be able by any means to procure these others at his hands. So fare you well, from my chamber this 10th of August, 1572. Yours or not his own, G.T. End of note. The pleasant fable of Fernando Jeronimi and Leonora de Velasco, translated out of the Italian riding tales of Bartello. In the pleasant country of Lombardy, and not far from the city of Florence, there was dwelling sometimes a lord of many rich seigniories and dominions, who nevertheless bare his name of the Castle of Velasco. This lord had only one son and two daughters. His son was called, during the life of his father, the heir of Velasco, who married a fair gentlewoman of the house of Bellavista named Leonora, the elder daughter of the Lord of Velasco, and called Franciscina, a young woman very toward both in capacity and other active qualities. Now the Lord of Velasco having already married his son and heir, and himself drawing in age, was desirous to see his daughters also bestowed before his death, and especially the eldest, who both for beauty and ripeness of age might often put him in remembrance that she was a collop of his own flesh, and therefore sought means to draw unto the house Fernando Jeronimi, a young gentleman of Venice, who delighting more in hawking, hunting, and other such pastimes than he did in study, had left his own house in Venice, and was coming into Lombardy to take the pleasures of the country. So that the Lord of Valesco, knowing him to be of a very good parentage, and therewithal not only rich but adorned with sundry good qualities, was desirous, as is said, to draw him home to his house under pretence of hunting and hawking, to the end he might behold his fair daughter Franchishina, who both for parentage and other worldly respects might no less content his mind than her beauty was likely to have allured his liking. But it fell out far contrary to his desire, for Fernando Jeronimi, beholding the Lady Leonora, who was indeed very fair, and of a very court-like behaviour, became enamored of her, and forgetting the courtesy that the Lord of Valesco had showed him in entertaining him and his servants with their horses by the space of 4 months, which is a rare courtesy nowadays, and especially in such a country, he sought all means possible to make the air of Valesco a becco, and to the end that all men may perceive what fruits grow on such trees, and what issues come of such intents. I will set down in English the fable as it is written in Italian by Bartello, and because I do suppose that Leonora is the same name which we call Elinor in English, and that Franchishina also doth import none other than Francis, I will so entitle them as to our own countrymen may be most perspicuous. Understand you then, that Ferdinando having now a hot affection unto the said Dame Elinor, and thinking it meeter to utter his first conceits in writing than in speech, did write unto her as followeth. End of page 1. Page 2 of The Adventures of Master F.J. by George Gascoigne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Note: Q1 here reads, when I had with no small entreaty obtained of Master F.J. and sundry other toward young gentlemen, the sundry copies of these sundry matters, then as well for that the number of them was great, as also for that I found none of them so barren but that in my judgment had in it a liquid salice, and especially being considered by the very proper occasion upon which it was written, as they themselves did always with the verse rehearse unto me the cause that then moved them to write, I did with more labour gather them into some order, and so placed them in this register, wherein as near as I could guesse, I have set in the first places those which Master F.J. did compile. And to begin with this his history that ensueth, it was, as he declared unto me, written upon this occasion. The said F.J. chanced once in the north parts of this realme to fall in company of a very fair gentlewoman, whose name was Mistress Elinor, unto whom, bearing a hot affection, he first adventured to write this letter following. End of note. Fair Lady, I pray you understand that, being altogether a stranger in this country, my good hap hath been to behold you to my no small contentation, and my evil hap accompanies the same with such imperfection of my deserts, as that I find always a ready repulse in mine own forwardness. So that considering the natural climate of the country, I must say that I have found fire in frost, and yet comparing the inequality of my deserts with the least part of your worthiness, I feel a continual frost in my most fervent fire. Such is then the extremity of my passions, the which I could never have been content to commit unto this telltale paper, were it not that I am destitute of all other help. Accept therefore, I beseech you, the earnest good will of a more trusty than worthy servant, who being thereby encouraged, may supply the defects of his ability with ready trial of dutiful loyalty. And let this poor paper, besprent with salt tears, and blowen over with scalding sighs, be saved of you as a safeguard for your sampler, or a bottom to wind your sewing silk, that when your last needleful is wrought, you may return to reading thereof, and consider the care of him who is more yours than his own, F.J. This letter by her received. Her answer was this: she took occasion one day at his request to dance with him, the which doing, she bashfully began to declare unto him, that she had read over the writing which he delivered unto her, with like protestation, that, as at delivery thereof, she understood not for what cause he thrust the same into her bosom. So now she could not perceive thereby any part of his meaning. Nevertheless, at last seemed to take upon her the matter, and though she disabled herself, yet gave him thanks, as, etc. Whereupon he brake the brawl, and walking abroad, devised immediately these few verses following. Fair Bersaba the bright, once bathing in a well, with dew bedimmed King David's eyes that ruled Israel, and Solomon himself, the source of sapience, against the force of such assaults could make but little defence. To it the stoutest yield, and strongest feel like woe. Bold Hercules and Sampson both did prove it to be so. What wonder seemeth then, when stars stand thick in skies, if such a blazing star have power to dim my dazzled eyes? L'Envoy. To you these few suffice, your wits be quick and good, you can conject to change of hue what humours feed my blood. F.J. Before he could put these verses in legible writing, it pleased Mistress Elinor of her courtesy thus to deal with him. Walking in a garden among divers other gentlemen and gentlewomen, with a little frowning smile in passing by him, she delivered unto him a paper, with these words: For that I understand not, quoth she, the intent of your letters, I pray you take them here again, and bestow them at your pleasure. The which done and said, she passed by without change either of pace or countenance. Fernando, somewhat troubled with her angry look, did suddenly leave the company, and walking into a park near adjoining, in great rage began to wreak his malice on this poor paper, and the same did rend and tear in pieces, when suddenly at a glance he perceived it was not of his own handwriting, and therewithal abashed. Upon better regard he perceived in one piece thereof written in Roman these letters: Cole, which in English betokeneth she, whereof placing all the pieces thereof as orderly as he could, he found therein written these few lines hereafter following. Your sudden departure from our pastime yesterday did enforce me for lack of chosen company to return unto my work, wherein I did so long continue, till at the last the bare bottom did draw unto my remembrance your strange request. And although I found therein no just cause to credit your colored words, yet have I thought good hereby to requite you with like courtesy, so that at least you shall not condemn me for ungrateful. But as to the matter therein contained, if I could persuade myself that there were in me any coals to kindle such sparks of fire, I might yet peradventure be drawn to believe that your mind were frozen with like fear. But as no smoke ariseth where no coal is kindled, so without cause of affection, the passion is easy to be cured. This is all that I understand of your dark letters, and as much as I mean to answer. Cole, in English, she. Fernando immediately upon receipt hereof, grew in jealousy that the same was not her own device, and therein I have no less allowed his judgment, than commended his invention of the verses and letters before rehearsed. For as by the style this letter of hers bewrayeth that it was not penned by a womans capacity, so the sequel of her doings may decipher. that she had more ready clerks than trusty servants in store. Well yet as the perfect hound, when he hath chased the hurt deer amid the whole herd, will never give over till he have singled it again. Even so Ferdinando, though somewhat abashed with this doubtful show, yet still constant in his former intention, ceased not by all possible means to bring this deer yet once again to the boughs, where she might be the more surely stricken, and so in the end enforced to yield. Wherefore he thought not best to commit the said verses willingly into her custody, but privily lost them in her chamber, written in counterfeit. And after on the next day thought better to reply, either upon her or upon her secretary, in this wise, as here followeth. The much that you have answered is very much, and much more than I am able to reply unto. Nevertheless, in mine own defence, thus much I allege, that if my sudden departure pleased not you, I cannot myself therewith be pleased, as one that seeketh not to please many, and more desirous to please you than any. The cause of mine affection, I suppose you behold daily. For self-love avoided, every wight may judge of themselves as much as reason persuadeth. The which if it be in your good nature suppressed with bashfulness, then mighty Jove grant you may once behold my wan cheeks washed in woe, that therein my salt tears may be a mirror to represent your own shadow, and that like unto Narcissus, you may be constrained to kiss the cold waves, wherein your counterfeit is so lively portrayed. For if abundance of other matters failed to draw my gazing eyes in contemplation of so rare excellency, yet might these your letters both frame in me an admiration of such divine esprit, and a confusion to my dull understanding, which so rashly presumed to wander in this endless labyrinth. Such I esteem you, and thereby am become such, and even he, F.J. This letter finished and fair written over, his chance was to meet her alone in a gallery of the same house, where his manhood in this kind of combat was first tried. And therein I can compare him to a valiant prince, who distressed with power of enemies, had committed the safeguard of his person to treaty of ambassade, and suddenly, surprised with a camisado in his own trenches, was enforced to yield as prisoner. Even so Fernando Jeronimi, lately overcome by the beautiful beams of this Dame Elinor, and having now committed his most secret intent to these late rehearsed letters, was at unwares encountered by his friendly foe, and constrained either to prepare some new defence, or else, like a recreant, to yield himself as already vanquished. Wherefore, as in a trance, he lifted up his dazzled eyes, and so continued in a certain kind of admiration, not unlike the astronomer, who, having after a whole night's travail, in the grey morning found his desired star, hath fixed his hungry eyes to behold the comet long looked for, whereat this gracious dame, as one that could discern the sun before her chamber windows were wide open, did deign to embolden the fainting knight with these or like words. I perceive now, quod she, how mishap doth follow me, that having chosen this walk for a simple solace, I am here disquieted by the man that meaneth my destruction, and therewithal, as half angry, began to turn her back, when Ferdinando, now awaked, gan thus salute her. Mistress, quod he, and I perceive now, that good hap haunts me, for being by lack of opportunity constrained to commit my welfare unto these blabbing leaves of bewraying paper, showing that in his hand. I am here recomforted with happy view of my desired joy. And therewithal reverently kissing his hand, did softly distrain her slender arm, and so stayed her departure. End of page 2. Page 3 of The Adventures of Master F.J. by George Gascoigne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The first blow thus proffered and defended, they walked and talked traversing divers ways, wherein I doubt not but that the Venetian could quit himself reasonably well. For after long talk, she was contented to accept his proffered service, but yet still disabling herself, and seeming to marvel what cause had moved him to subject his liberty so wilfully, or at least in a prison, as she termed it, so unworthy. Whereunto I need not rehearse his answer, but suppose now that thus they departed, saving I had forgotten this, she required of him the last rehearsed letter, saying that his first was lost, and now she lacked a new bottom for her silk, the which I warrant you he granted. And so proffering to take an humble congé by beso las manos, she graciously gave him the zucado des labros, and so for then departed. And thereupon recounting her words, he compiled these following, which he termed terza sequenza, to sweet mistress she. Of thee, dear dame, 3 lessons would I learn. What reason first persuades the foolish fly, as soon as she a candle can discern, to play with flame till she be burnt thereby? Or what may move the mouse to bite the bait, which strikes the trap that stops her hungry breath? What calls the bird, where snares of deep deceit are closely couched to draw her to her death? Consider well, what is the cause of this, and though per case thou wilt not so confesse, yet deep desire to gain a heavenly blisse may drown the mind in dole and dark distresse. Oft is it seen, whereat my heart may bleed, fools play so long till they be caught indeed. And then it is a heaven to see them hop and skip, and seek all shifts to shake their shackles off. It is a world to see them hang the lip, who erst at love were wont to scorn and scoff, but as the mouse once caught in crafty trap, may bounce and beat against the bourden wall, till she have brought her head in such mishap, that down to death her fainting limbs must fall. And as the fly, once singed in the flame, cannot command her wings to wave away, but by the heel she hangeth in the same, till cruel death her hasty journey stay. So they that seek to break the links of love, strive with the stream, and this by pain I prove. For when I first beheld that heavenly hue of thine, thy stately stature, and thy comely grace, I must confesse these dazzled eyes of mine did wink for fear when I first viewed thy face, but bold desire did open them againe, and bade me look till I had looked too long. I pitied them that did procure my paine, and loved the looks that wrought me all the wrong. And as the bird once caught, but works her woe, that strives to leave the limed twigs behind, even so the more I strove to part thee fro, the greater grief did grow within my mind. Remediless then must I yield to thee, and crave no more thy servant but to be. Till then, and ever, he, F.J. When he had well sorted this sequence, he sought opportunity to leave it where she might find it before it were lost. And now the coales began to kindle, whereof but erewhile she feigned herself altogether ignorant. The flames began to break out on every side, and she to quench them, shut up herself in her chamber solitarily. But as the smithy gathers greater heat by casting on of water, even so the more she absented herself from company, the fresher was the grief which galled her remembrance, so that at last the report was spread through the house, that Mistress Elinor was sick. At which news Fernando took small comfort. Nevertheless, Dame Venus, with good aspect, did yet thus much further his enterprise. The Dame, whether it were by sudden change, or by wonted custome, fell one day into a great bleeding at the nose, for which accident the said Venetian, amongst other pretty conceits, had a present remedy, whereby he took occasion, when they of the house had all in vain sought many wayes to stop her bleeding, to worke his feat in this wise. First he pleaded ignorance, as though he knew not her name, and therefore demanded the same of Mistresse Fraunces, who when she had to him declared that her name was Elinor, he said these words, or very like in effect: If I thought I should not offend Mistresse Elinor, I would not doubt to stop her bleeding, without either paine or difficulty. This gentlewoman, somewhat tickled with his words, did incontinent make relation thereof to the said Mistresse Elinor, who immediately, declaring that Fernando was her late received servant, returned the said messenger unto him with especial charge, that he should employ his devoir towards the recovery of her health, with whom the same Fernando repaired to the chamber of his desired, and finding her set in a chair, leaning on the one side over a silver bason, after his due reverence, he laid his hand on her temples, and privily rounding her in the eare, desired her to command a hazell sticke and a knife, the which being brought, he delivered unto her, saying on this wise: Mistresse, I will speake certain words in secret to my selfe, and do require no more. But when you hear me say openly this word Amen, that you with this knife will make a nick upon this hazell sticke, and when you have made 5 nicks, command me also to cease. The dame partly of good will to the knight, and partly to be stanched of her bleeding, commanded her mayd, and required the other gentles somewhat to stand aside, which done, he began his orisons, wherein he had not long muttered, before he pronounced Amen, wherewith the lady made a nick on the stick with her knife. The said Fernando continued to another Amen, when the lady having made another nick, felt her bleeding begin to stanch, and so by the third Amen thoroughly stanched. Fernando then changing his prayers into private talke, said softly unto her: Mistresse, I am glad that I am hereby enabled to do you some service, and as the stanching of your own blood may some way recomfort you, so if the shedding of my blood may any way content you, I beseech you command it, for it shall be evermore readily employed in your service. And therewithal with a loud voice pronounced Amen, wherewith the good lady making a nick, did secretly answer thus: Good servant, quod she, I must needs think my selfe right happy to have gained your service and good will, and be you sure, that although there be in me no such desert as may draw you into this depth of affection, yet such as I am, I shall be alwayes glad to shew my selfe thankfull unto you. And now, if you think your selfe assured that I shall bleed no more, do then pronounce your 5th Amen. The which pronounced, she made also her 5th nick, and held up her head, calling the company unto her, and declaring unto them that her bleeding was thoroughly stanched. And Fernando tarrying a while in the chamber, found opportunity to lose his sequence neere to his desired mistresse, and after congé taken, departed. After whose departure the lady arose out of her chair, and her mayd going about to remove the same, espied and tooke up the writing, the which her mistresse perceiving, gan suddenly conjecture that the same had in it some like matter to the verses once before left in like manner, and made semblant to mistrust that the same should be some words of conjuration, and taking it from her mayd, did peruse it, and immediately said to the company, that she would not forego the same for a great treasure. But to be plain, I think that, Fernando excepted, she was glad to be rid of all company, until she had with sufficient leisure turned over and retossed every card in this sequence, and not long after, being now tickled through all the veines with an unknown humour, adventured of her selfe to commit unto a like ambassador the decyphering of that which hitherto she had kept more secret. and thereupon wrote with her own hand and head in this wise: Good servant, I am out of all doubt much beholding unto you, and I have great comfort by your meanes in the stanching of my blood. And I take great comfort to read your letters, and I have found in my chamber divers songs which I think to be of your making, and I promise you they are excellently made. And I assure you that I will be ready to do for you any pleasure that I can during my life. Wherefore I pray you come to my chamber once in a day, till I come abroad again, and I will be glad of your company. And for because that you have promised to be my he, I will take upon me this name, your she. This letter was doubtless of her own handwriting, and as therein the reader may find great difference of style from her former letter, so may you now understand the cause. She had in the same house a friend, a servant, a secretary, what should I name him? Such one as she esteemed in time past, more than was cause in time present. And to make my tale good, I will, by the same words that Bartello useth, describe him unto you. He was in height the proportion of 2 pygmies, in breadth the thickness of 2 bacon hogs, of presumption a giant, of power a gnat, apishly witted, knavishly mannered, and crabbedly favoured. What was there in him then to draw a fair lady's liking? Marry, sir, even all in all, a well-lined purse, wherewith he could at every call provide such pretty conceits as pleased her peevish fantasy, and by that means he had thoroughly, long before, insinuated himself with this amorous dame. This manling, this minion, this slave, this secretary, was now by occasion ridden to Florence forsooth, and though his absence were unto her a disfurnishing of eloquence, it was yet unto Fernando Jeronimi an opportunity of good advantage. For when he perceived the change of her style, and thereby grew in some suspicion that the same proceeded by absence of her chief chancellor, he thought good now to smite while the iron was hot, and to lend his mistress such a pen in her secretary's absence, as he should never be able at his return to amend the well writing thereof. Wherefore, according to her command, he repaired once every day to her chamber, at the least whereas he guided himself so well, and could devise such store of sundry pleasures and pastimes, that he grew in favour not only with his desired, but also with the rest of the gentlewomen. And one day passing the time amongst them, their play grew to this end, that his mistress, being queen, demanded of him these 3 questions. Servant, quod she, I charge you, as well upon your allegiance being now my subject, as also upon your fidelity, having vowed your service unto me, that you answer me these 3 questions, by the very truth of your secret thought. First, what thing in this universal world doth most rejoice and comfort you? Fernando Jeronimi, abasing his eyes towards the ground, took good advisement in his answer, when a fair gentlewoman of the company clapped him on the shoulder, saying, How now, sir? Is your hand on your halfpenny? To whom he answered, No, fair lady, my hand is on my heart, and yet my heart is not in mine own hands. Wherewithal abashed, turning towards Dame Elinor, he said, My sovereign and mistress, according to the charge of your command, and the duty that I owe you, my tongue shall bewray unto you the truth of mine intent. At this present a reward given me without desert, doth so rejoice me with continual remembrance, that though my mind be so occupied to think thereon, as that day nor night I can be quiet from that thought, yet the joy and pleasure which I conceive in the same is such, that I can neither be cloyed with continuance thereof, nor yet afraid that any mishap can countervail so great a treasure. This is to me such a heaven to dwell in, as that I feed by day, and repose by night, upon the fresh record of this reward. This, as Bartello saith, he meant by the kiss that she lent him in the gallery, and by the profession of her last letters and words. Well, though this answer be somewhat misty, yet let his excuse be, that taken upon the sudden, he thought better to answer darkly, than to be mistrusted openly. Her second question was, what thing in this life did most grieve his heart, and disquiet his mind? Whereunto he answered, that although his late rehearsed joy were incomparable, yet the greatest enemy that disturbed the same was the privy worm of his own guilty conscience, which accused him evermore with great unworthiness, and that this was his greatest grief. The lady, biting upon the bit at his cunning answers made unto these two questions, gan thus reply: Servant, I had thought to have touched you yet nearer with my third question, but I will refrain to attempt your patience. And now for my third demand, answer me directly in what manner this passion doth handle you, and how these contraries may hang together by any possibility of concord, for your words are strange. Ferdinando, now rousing himself boldly, took occasion thus to handle his answer. Mistress, quod he, my words indeed are strange, but yet my passion is much stranger. And thereupon this other day, to content mine own fantasy, I devised a sonnet, which although it be a piece of cockerel's music, and such as I might be ashamed to publish in this company, yet because my truth in this answer may the better appear unto you, I pray you vouchsafe to receive the same in writing. And drawing a paper out of his pocket, presented it to her, wherein was written this sonnet: Love, hope, and death do stir in me such strife, as never man but I led such a life. First burning love doth wound my heart to death, and when death comes at call of inward grief, cold lingering hope doth feed my fainting breath, against my will, and yields my wound relief. So that I live, but yet my life is such, as death would never grieve me half so much. No comfort then, but only this I taste, to salve such sore, such hope will never want, and with such hope such life will ever last, and with such life such sorrows are not scant. O strange desire, O life with torments tost, through too much hope, mine only hope is lost. Even he, F.J. This sonnet was highly commended, and in my judgment it deserveth no less. His duty thus performed, their pastimes ended, and at their departure, for a watchword, he counselled his mistress by little and little to walk abroad, saying that the gallery near adjoining was so pleasant, as if he were half dead, he thought that by walking therein, he might be half and more revived. Think you so, servant? Quod she. And the last time that I walked there, I suppose I took the cause of my malady, but by your advice, for that you have so clerkly stanched my bleeding, I will assay to walk there to-morrow. Mistress, quod he, and in more full accomplishment of my duty towards you, and in sure hope that you will use the same only to your own private commodity, I will there await upon you, and between you and me will teach you the full order how to stanch the bleeding of any creature, whereby you shall be as cunning as myself. Gramercy, good servant, quod she. I think you lost the same in writing here yesterday, but I cannot understand it, and therefore to-morrow, if I feel myself any thing amended, I will send for you thither to instruct me thoroughly. Thus they departed. And at supper time, the Lord of Valesco, finding fault that his guest's stomach served him no better, began to accuse the grossness of his viands. To whom one of the gentlewomen, which had passed the afternoon in his company, answered, Nay, sir, quod she, this gentleman hath a passion. the which once in a day at the least doth kill his appetite. Are you so well acquainted with the disposition of his body, quod the lord of the house? By his own saying, quod she, and not otherwise. Fair lady, quod Ferdinando, you either mistook me or overheard me then, for I told of a comfortable humour which so fed me with continual remembrance of joy, as that my stomach being full thereof doth desire in manner none other victuals. Why, sir, quod the host, do you then live by love? God forbid, sir, quod Ferdinando, for then my cheeks would be much thinner than they be. But there are divers other greater causes of joy, than the doubtful lots of love. And for mine own part, to be plain, I cannot love, and I dare not hate. I would I thought so, quod the gentlewoman. And thus with pretty nips they passed over their supper. Which ended, the lord of the house required Fernando Jeronimi to dance and passe the time with the gentlewomen, which he refused not to do. But suddenly, before the musique was well tuned, came out Dame Elinor in her night attire, and said to the lord, that supposing the solitarinesse of her chamber had increased her malady, she came out for her better recreation, to see them dance. Well done, daughter, quod the lord. And I, mistress, quod Ferdinando, would gladly bestow the leading of you about this great chamber, to drive away the faintnesse of your fever. No, good servant, quod the lady, but in my stead I pray you dance with this faire gentlewoman, pointing him to the lady that had so taken him up at supper. Ferdinando, to avoid mistrust, did agree to her request without further entreaty. The dance begun, this knight marched on with the image of Signorina Frances in his hand, and Signorina Elinor in his heart. The violans at end of the pavilion stayed a while, in which time this dame said to Fernando Jeronimi on this wise: I am right sorry for you in two respects, although the familiarity have hitherto had no great continuance between us. And as I do lament your case, so do I rejoice, for mine own contentation, that I shall now see a due trial of the experiment which I have long desired. End of page 3. Page 4 of The Adventures of Master F.J. by George Gascoigne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. This said, she kept silence, when Ferdinando, somewhat astonied with her strange speech, thus answered: Mistress, although I cannot conceive the meaning of your words, yet by courtesie I am constrained to yield you thanks for your good will, the which appeareth no lesse in lamenting of mishaps, than in rejoycing at good fortune. What experiment you meane to try by me, I know not, but I dare assure you that my skill in experiments is very simple. Herewith the instruments sounded a new measure, and they passed forwards, leaving to talk, until the noise ceased. Which done, the gentlewoman replied: I am sorry, sir, that you did erewhile deny love and all his laws, and that in so open audience. Not so, quod Ferdinando, but as the word was roundly taken, so can I readily answer it by good reason. Well, quod she, how if the hearers will admit no reasonable answer? My reasons yet be neverthelesse, quod he, in reasonable judgment. Herewith she smiled, and he cast a glance towards Dame Elinor. Ah, ascances, art thou pleased? Again the viols called them forthwards, and again at the end of the brawl, said Ferdinando Jeronimi to this gentlewoman: I pray you, mistress, and what may be the second cause of your sorrow sustained in my behalf? Nay, soft, quod she, percase I have not yet told you the first. But content your selfe, for the second cause you shall never know at my hands, until I see due trial of the experiment which I have long desired. Why then, quod he, I can but wish a present occasion to bring the same to effect, to the end that I might also understand the mystery of your meaning. And so might you faile of your purpose, quod she, for I meane to be better assured of him that shall know the depth of mine intent in such a secret, than I do suppose that any creature, one except, may be of you. Gentlewoman, quod he, you speak Greeke, the which I have now forgotten, and mine instructors are too far from me at this present to expound your words, or else too neere, quod she, and so smiling stayed her talke, when the musique called them to another daunce. Which ended, Ferdinando half afraid of false suspect, and more amazed at this strange talke, gave over, and bringing Mistresse Fraunces to her place, was thus saluted by his Mistresse. Servant, quod she, I have done you great wrong to have daunced with you, considering that this gentlewoman and you had former occasion of so weighty conference. Mistresse, said Ferdinando, you had done me great pleasure, for by our conference I have but brought my braines in a busie conjecture. I doubt not, said his Mistresse, but you will end that businesse easily. It is hard, said he, to end the thing, whereof yet I have found no beginning. His Mistresse with change of countenance kept silence, whereat Dame Fraunces rejoycing, cast out this bone to gnaw on. I perceive, quod she, it is evil to halt before a cripple. Ferdinando perceiving now that his Mistresse waxed angry, thought good on her behalfe thus to answer, and it is evil to hop before them that run for the bell. His Mistresse replied, and it is evil to hang the bell at their heeles which are alwayes running. The Lord of the Castle overhearing these proper quippes, rose out of his chaire, and coming towards Ferdinando required him to daunce a galliard. Sir, said he, I have hitherto at your appointment but walked about the house. Now if you be desirous to see one tumble a turn or twaine, it is like enough that I might provoke you to laugh at me. But in good faith my dauncing dayes are almost done. And therefore, sir, quod he, I pray you speak to them that are more nimble at tripping on the toe. Whilest he was thus saying, Dame Elinor had made her congé, and was now entring the door of her chamber, when Ferdinando, all amazed at her sudden departure, followed to take leave of his Mistresse. But she more than angry, refused to hear his good night, and entring her chamber caused her mayd to clap to the door. Ferdinando with heavy cheere returned to his company, and Mistresse Fraunces to touch his sore with a corrosive, said to him softly in this wise: Sir, you may now perceive that this our country cannot allow the French manner of dancing, for they, as I have heard tell, do more commonly daunce to talke, than entreat to daunce. Ferdinando hoping to drive out one naile with another, and thinking this a meane most convenient to suppresse all jealous supposes, took Mistresse Fraunces by the hand, and with a heavy smile answered, Mistresse and I, because I have seen the French manner of dancing, will eftsoons entreat you to daunce a barginette. What meane you by this, quod Mistresse Fraunces? If it please you to follow, quod he, you shall see that I can jest without joy, and laugh without lust. And calling the musicians, caused them softly to sound the tinternall, when he clearing his voice, did a la Napolitana apply these verses following, unto the measure. In prime of lusty years, when Cupid caught me in, and nature taught the way to love, how I might best begin, to please my wandring eye, in beauties tickle trade, to gaze on each that passed by, a careless sport I made. With sweet enticing bait, I fished for many a dame, and warmed me by many a fire, yet felt I not the flame. But when at last I spied that face that pleased me most, the coales were quick, the wood was dry, and I began to toast. And smiling yet full oft, I have beheld that face, when in my heart I might bewail mine own unlucky case, and oft again with looks that might bewray my grief, I pleaded hard for just reward, and sought to find relief. What will you more? So oft my gazing eyes did seek, to see the rose and lily strive upon that lively cheek, till at the last I spied, and by good proof I found, that in that face was painted plain the piercer of my wound. Then all too late aghast, I did my foot retire, and sought with secret sighs to quench my greedy scalding fire. But lo, I did prevail, as much to guide my will, as he that seeks with halting heel to hop against the hill. Or as the feeble sight would search the sunny beam, even so I found but labour lost to strive against the stream. Then gan I thus resolve, since liking forced love, should I mislike my happy choice before I did it prove? And since none other joy I had but her to see, should I retire my deep desire? No, no, it would not be, though great the duty were, that she did well deserve, and I poor man unworthy am so worthy a wight to serve. Yet hope my comfort stayed, that she would have regard to my good will, that nothing craved, but like for just reward. I see the falcon gent sometime will take delight to seek the solace of her wing, and dally with a kite. The fairest wolf will choose the foulest for her make, and why? Because he doth endure most sorrow for her sake. Even so had I like hope, when doleful days were spent, when weary words were wasted well, to open true intent. When floods of flowing tears had washed my weeping eyes, when trembling tongue had troubled her with loud lamenting cries, at last her worthy will would pity this my plaint, and comfort me, her own poor slave, whom fear had made so faint. Wherefore I made a vow, the stony rock should start, ere I presume to let her slip out of my faithful heart. L'Envoy. And when she saw by proof the pith of my good will, she took in worth this simple song, for want of better skill. And as my just deserts her gentle heart did move, she was content to answer thus, I am content to love. F.J. By these verses he meant in clouds to decipher unto Mistress Frances such matter as she would snatch at, and yet could take no good hold of the same. Furthermore, it answered very aptly to the note which the music sounded, as the skilful reader by due trial may approve. This singing dance, or dancing song, ended, Mistress Frances, giving due thanks, seemed weary also of the company, and proffering to depart, gave yet this farewell to Ferdinando, not vexed by choler, but pleased with contentation, and called away by heavy sleep. I am constrained, quod she, to bid you good night, and so turning to the rest of the company, took her leave. Then the master of the house commanded a torch to light Ferdinando to his lodging, where the sudden change of his mistress' countenance, together with the strangeness of Mistress Frances' talk, made such an encounter in his mind, that he could take no rest that night. Wherefore in the morning, rising very early, although it were far before his mistress' hour, he cooled his choler by walking in the gallery near to her lodging, and there in this passion compiled these verses following. A cloud of care hath covered all my coast, and storms of strife do threaten to appear. The waves of woe, which I mistrusted most, have broke the banks wherein my life lay clear. Chips of ill chance are fallen amid my choice, to mar the mind that meant for to rejoice. Before I sought, I found the haven of hap, wherein once found I sought to shroud my ship, but lowering love hath lift me from her lap, and crabbed lot begins to hang the lip. The props of dark mistrust do fall so thick, they pierce my coat, and touch my skin at quick. What may be said, where truth can not prevail? What plea may serve, where will itself is judge? What reason rules, where right and reason fail? Remediless then must the guiltless trudge, and seek out care, to be the carving knife, to cut the thread that lingereth such a life. F.J. This is but a rough metre, and reason, for it was devised in great disquiet of mind, and written in rage. But to the matter. End of page 4. Page 5 of The Adventures of Master F.J. by George Gascoigne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. When he had long, and all in vain, looked for the coming of his mistress into her appointed walk, he wandered into the park near adjoining to the castle wall, where his chance was to meet Mistress Frances, accompanied with one other gentlewoman, by whom he passed with a reverence of courtesy, and so walking on came into the side of a thicket, where he sat down under a tree to allay his sadness with solitariness. Mistress Frances, partly of courtesy and affection, and partly to content her mind by continuance of such talk as they had commenced overnight, entreated her companion to go with her unto this tree of reformation, whereas they found the knight with his arms folded in a heavy kind of contemplation, unto whom Mistress Frances stepped a pace, right softly, and at unawares gave this salutation. I little thought, Sir Knight, quoth she, by your evensong yesternight, to have found you presently at such a morrow mass, but I perceive you serve your saint with double devotion, and I pray God grant you treble meed for your true intent. He being taken thus upon a sudden, could none otherwise answer but thus. I told you, mistress, quod he, that I could laugh without lust, and jest without joy. And therewithal starting up, with a more bold countenance came towards the dames, proffering unto them his service to wait upon them homewards. I have heard say oft times, quod Mistress Frances, that it is hard to serve two masters at one time, but we will be right glad of your company. I thank you, quod he, and so walking on with them, fell into sundry discourses, still refusing to touch any part of their former communication, until Mistress Frances said unto him, By my troth, quod she, I would be your debtor these 2 days, to answer me truly but unto one question that I will propound. Fair gentlewoman, quod he, you shall not need to become my debtor, but if it please you to quit question by question, I will be more ready to gratify you in this request, than either reason requireth, or than you would be willing to work my contentation. Master Fernando Jeronimi, quod she, and that sadly, peradventure you know but a little how willing I would be to procure your contentation, but you know that hitherto familiarity hath taken no deep root betwixt us twain, and though I find in you no manner of cause whereby I might doubt to commit this or greater matter unto you, yet have I stayed hitherto so to do, in doubt lest you might thereby justly condemn me both of arrogancy and lack of discretion, wherewith I must yet foolishly affirm, that I have with great pain bridled my tongue from disclosing the same unto you. Such is then the good will that I bear towards you, the which if you would rather judge to be impudency, than a friendly meaning, I may then curse the hour that I first concluded thus to deal with you. Herewithal, being now red for chaste bashfulness, she abased her eyes, and stayed her talk. To whom Fernando thus answered, Mistress Frances, if I should with so exceeding villainy requite such and so exceeding great courtesy, I might not only seem to degenerate from all gentry, but also to differ in behaviour from all the rest of my life spent. Wherefore, to be plain with you in few words, I think myself so much bound unto you for divers respects, as if ability do not fail me, you shall find me mindful in requital of the same, and for disclosing your mind to me, you may, if so it please you, adventure it without adventure, for by this Sun, quod he, I will not deceive such trust as you shall lay upon me, and furthermore, so far forth as I may, I will be yours in any respect. Wherefore I beseech you accept me for your faithful friend, and so shall you surely find me. Not so, quod she, but you shall be my trust, if you vouchsafe the name, and I will be to you as you shall please to term it. My hope, quod he, if you be so pleased. And thus agreed, they two walked apart from the other gentlewoman, and fell into sad talk, wherein Mistress Frances did very courteously declare unto him, that indeed one cause of her sorrow sustained in his behalf, was that he had said so openly overnight that he could not love, for she perceived very well the affection between him and Madame Elinor, and she was also advertised that Dame Elinor stood in the portal of her chamber, hearkening to the talk that they had at supper that night. Wherefore she seemed to be sorry that such a word rashly escaped might become great hindrance unto his desire. But a greater cause of her grief was, as she declared, that his hap was to bestow his liking so unworthily, for she seemed to accuse Dame Elinor for the most unconstant woman living. In full proof whereof, she bewrayed unto him how she, the same Dame Elinor, had long time been yielded to the minion secretary, whom I have before described, in whom though there be, quod she, no one point of worthiness, yet shameth she not to use him as her dearest friend, or rather her holiest idol, and that this notwithstanding Dame Elinor had been also sundry times won to choice of change, as she named unto Fernando two gentlemen, whereof the one was named Hercule Donati, and the other Hannibal de Cosmus, by whom she was during sundry times of their several abode in those countries entreated to like courtesy. For these causes the Dame Frances seemed to mislike his choice, and to lament that she doubted in processe of time to see him abused. The experiment she meant was this, for that she thought Ferdinando, I use Bartello's words, a man in every respect very worthy to have the several use of a more commodious common. She hoped now to see if his enclosure thereof might be defensible against her said secretary, and such like. These things and divers other of great importance, this courteous Lady Frances did friendly disclose unto him, and furthermore, did both instruct and advise him to proceed in his enterprise. Now to make my talk good, and lest the reader might be drawn in a jealous suppose of this Lady Frances, I must let you understand that she was a virgin of rare chastity, singular capacity, notable modesty, and excellent beauty. And though Fernando Jeronimi had cast his affection on the other, being a married woman, yet was there in their beauties no great difference, but in all other good gifts a wonderful diversity, as might between constancy and flitting fantasy, between womanly countenance and girlish garishness, between hot dissimulation and temperate fidelity. Now if any man will curiously ask the question why he should choose the one and leave the other, over and besides the common proverb, so many men, so many minds, thus may be answered, we see by common experience, that the highest flying falcon doth more commonly prey upon the corn-fed crow, and the simple shiftless dove, than on the mounting kite. And why? Because the one is overcome with less difficulty than that other. Thus much in defence of this Lady Frances, and to excuse the choice of Ferdinando, who thought himself now no less beholding to good fortune to have found such a trusty friend, then bounden to Dame Venus, to have won such a mistress. And to return unto my pretence, understand you, that he, being now with these two fair ladies, come very near the castle, grew in some jealous doubt, as on his own behalf, whether he were best to break company or not, when his assured hope, perceiving the same, gan thus recomfort him. Good sir, quod she, if you trusted your trusty friends, you should not need thus cowardly to stand in dread of your friendly enemies. Well said in faith, quod Fernando, and I must confesse, you were in my bosom before I wist, but yet I have heard said often, that in trust is treason. Well spoken for yourself, quod his hope. Fernando, now remembering that he had but erewhile taken upon him the name of her trust, came home per misericordiam, when his hope entering the castle gate, caught hold of his lap, and half by force led him by the gallery unto his mistress' chamber. Whereas after a little dissembling disdaine, he was at last by the good help of his hope right thankfully received. And for his mistress was now ready to dine, he was therefore for that time arrested there, and a supersadius sent into the great chamber unto the lord of the house, who expected his coming out of the park. The dinner ended, and he thoroughly contented both with welfare and welcome, they fell into sundry devices of pastime. At last Fernando, taking into his hand a lute that lay on his mistress' bed, did unto the note of the Venetian galliard apply the Italian ditty, written by the worthy Bradamant unto the noble Rugier, as Ariosto hath it. Rugier quath semper qui, etc. But his mistress could not be quiet until she heard him repeat the tinternel, which he used overnight, the which he refused not. At end whereof his mistress, thinking how she had shewed herself too earnest to use any further dissimulation, especially perceiving the toward inclination of her servants hope, fell to flat and plain dealing, and walked to the window, calling her servant apart unto her, of whom she demanded secretly and in sad earnest, who devised this tinternel. My father's sister's brother's son, quod he. His mistress laughing right heartily, demanded yet again, by whom the same was figured. By a niece to an aunt of yours, mistress, quod he. Well then, servant, quoth she, I swear unto you by my father's soul, that my mother's youngest daughter doth love your father's eldest son above any creature living. Fernando, hereby recomforted, gan thus reply: Mistress, though my father's eldest son be far unworthy of so noble a match, yet since it pleaseth her so well to accept him, I would thus much say behind his back, that your mother's daughter hath done him some wrong. And wherein, servant, quod she. By my troth, mistress, quod he, it is not yet 20 hours since without touch of breast, she gave him such a nip by the heart, as did altogether bereave him his night's rest with the bruise thereof. Well, servant, quod she, content yourself. For your sake, I will speak to her to provide him a plaster, the which I myself will apply to his hurt. And to the end it may work the better with him, I will purvey a lodging for him, where hereafter he may sleep at more quiet. This said, the rosy hue disdained her sickly cheeks, and she returned to the company, leaving Fernando ravished between hope and dread, as one that could neither conjecture the meaning of her mystical words, nor assuredly trust unto the knot of her sliding affections. When the Lady Frances, coming to him, demanded, What dream you, sir? Yea, marry do I, fair lady, quod he. And what was your dream, sir? Quod she. I dreamt, quod he, that walking in a pleasant garden, garnished with sundry delights, my hap was to espy, hanging in the air, a hope wherein I might well behold the aspects and face of the heavens, and calling to remembrance the day and hour of my nativity, I did thereby, according to my small skill in astronomy, try the conclusion of mine adventures. And what found you therein? Quod Dame Frances. You awaked me out of my dream, quod he, or else peradventure you should not have known. I believe you well, quod the Lady Frances, and laughing at his quick answer, brought him by the hand unto the rest of his company, where he tarried not long before his gracious mistress bade him to farewell, and to keep his hour there again, when he should by her be summoned. Hereby he passed the rest of that day in hope, awaiting the happy time when his mistress should send for him. Supper time came and passed over, and not long after came the handmaid of the Lady Elinor into the great chamber, desiring him to repair unto their mistress, the which he willingly accomplished, and being now entered into her chamber, he might perceive his mistress in her night's attire, preparing herself towards bed, to whom Fernando said, Why, how now, mistress? I had thought this night to have seen you dance, at least, or at last, amongst us. By my troth, good servant, quoth she, I adventured so soon unto the great chamber yesternight, that I find myself somewhat sickly disposed, and therefore do strain courtesie, as you see, to go the sooner to my bed this night. But before I sleep, quoth she, I am to charge you with a matter of weight, and taking him apart from the rest, declared that, as that present night, she would talk with him more at large in the gallery near adjoining to her chamber. Hereupon Fernando, discreetly dissimulating his joy, took his leave and returned into the great chamber, where he had not long continued, before the lord of the castle commanded a torch to light him unto his lodging, whereas he prepared himself and went to bed, commanding his servant also to go to his rest. And when he thought as well his servant as the rest of the household to be safe, he arose again, and taking his nightgown, did under the same convey his naked sword, and so walked to the gallery, where he found his good mistress walking in her nightgown, and attending his coming. End of page 5. Page 6 of The Adventures of Master F.J. by George Gascoigne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The moon was now at the full, the skies clear and the weather temperate, by reason whereof he might the more plainly and with the greater contentation behold his long desired joyes. And spreading his arms abroad to embrace his loving mistress, he said, O my dear lady, when shall I be able with any desert to countervail the least part of this your bountiful goodness? The dame, whether it were of fear indeed, or that the wiliness of womanhood had taught her to cover her conceits with some fine dissimulation, start back from the knight, and shrieking, but softly, said unto him, Alas, servant, what have I deserved that you come against me with naked sword as against an open enemy? Ferdinando, perceiving her intent, excused himself, declaring that he brought the same for their defence, and not to offend her in any wise. The lady being therewith somewhat appeased, they began with more comfortable gesture to expel the dread of the said late affright, and sithens to become bolder of behaviour, more familiar in speech, and most kind in accomplishing of common comfort. But why hold I so long discourse in describing the joyes which, for lack of like experience, I cannot set out to the full? Note, Q1 here inserts. Were it not that I know to whom I write, I would the more beware what I write. F.J. was a man, and neither of us are senseless, and therefore I should slander him, over and besides a great obloquy to the whole genealogy of Aeneas. if I should imagine that of tender heart he would forbear to express her more tender limbs against the hard floor. Sufficed that of her courteous nature she was content to accept boards for a bed of down, mats for cameric sheets, and the nightgown of F.J. for a counterpoint to cover them. And thus, with calm content, instead of quiet sleep, they beguiled the night, until the proudest star began to abandon the firmament, when F.J. and his mistress were constrained also to abandon their delights, and with 10,000 sweet kisses and straight embracings, did frame themselves to play loath to depart. End of note. Well, remedy there was none, but Dame Elinor must return unto her chamber, and he must also convey, as closely as might be, into his chamber, the which was hard to do, the day being so far sprung, and he having a large base court to pass over before he could recover his stair-foot door. And though he were not much perceived, yet the Lady Frances being no less desirous to see an issue of these enterprises, than he was willing to cover them in secrecy, laid watch, and even at the entring of his chamber door, perceived the point of his naked sword glistening under the skirt of his nightgown, whereat she smiled and said to herself, this gear goeth well about. Well, Ferdinando having now recovered his chamber, he went to bed. There let him sleep, as his mistress did on the other side. Although the Lady Frances, being thoroughly tickled now in all the veins, could not enjoy such quiet rest, but arising took another gentlewoman of the house with her, and walked into the park to take the fresh air of the morning. They had not long walked there, but they returned, and though Fernando Jeronimi had not yet slept sufficiently for one which had so far travailed in the night past, yet they went in to his chamber to raise him, and coming to his bedside found him fast asleep. Alas, quoth that other gentlewoman, it were pity to awake him. Even so it were, quod Dame Frances, but we will take away somewhat of his, whereby he may perceive that we were here, and, looking about the chamber, his naked sword presented itself to the hands of Dame Frances, who took it with her, and softly shutting his chamber door again, went down the stairs, and recovered her own lodging in good order and unperceived of anybody, saving only that other gentlewoman which accompanied with her. At the last Ferdinando awaked, and appareling himself, walked out also to take the air, and being thoroughly recomforted, as well with remembrance of his joys forepast, as well with the pleasant harmony which the birds made on every side, and the fragrant smell of the redolent flowers and blossoms which budded on every branch, he did in these delights compile these verses following. Note, Q1 here inserts. The occasion, as I have heard him rehearse, was the encounter that he had with his lady by light of the moon, and forasmuch as the moon in midst of their delights did vanish away, or was overspread with a cloud, thereupon he took the subject of his theme, and thus it ensueth, called a moonshine banquet. End of note. Dame Cynthia herself that shines so bright, and deigneth not to leave her lofty place, but only then when Phoebus showes his face, which is her brother born and lends her light, disdained not yet to do my lady right, to prove that in such heavenly wights as she, it fitteth best that right and reason be. For when she spied my lady's golden rays, into the clouds her head she shrouds, and shamed to shine where she her beames displays. Good reason yet, that to my simple skill, I should the name of Cynthia adore, by whose high help I might behold the more my lady's lovely looks at mine own will, with deep content to gaze, and gaze my fill of courtesie, and not of dark disdaine. Dame Cynthia disclosed my lady plain, she did but lend her light, as for a light, with friendly grace to show her face, that else would show and shine in her despite. Dan Phoebus, he with many a lowering look, had her beheld of yore in angry wise, and when he could none other mean devise, to stain her name, this deep deceit he took, to be the bait that best might hide his hook. Into her eyes his parching beams he cast, to scorch their skins that gazed on her full fast, whereby when many a man was sunburnt so, they thought my queen the sun had been with scalding flames which wrought them all that woe. So that when many a look had looked so long, as that their eyes were dim and dazzled both, some fainting hearts that were both lewd and loath to look again from whence that error sprung, gan close their eyes for fear of farther wrong, and some again once drawn into the maze, gan lewdly blame the beams of beauty's blaze. But I with deep foresight did soon espy, how Phoebus meant by false intent to slander so her name with cruelty. Wherefore at better leisure thought I best, to try the treason of his treachery, and to exalt my lady's dignity, when Phoebus fled and drew him down to rest, amid the waves that welter in the west. I gan behold this lovely lady's face, whereon Dame Nature spent her gifts of grace, and found therein no parching heat at all, but such bright hue as might renew an angel's joys in reign celestial. The courteous moon that wished to do me good, did shine to show my dame more perfectly, but when she saw her passing jollity, the moon for shame did blush as red as blood, and shrunk aside and kept her horns in hood. So that now when Dame Cynthia was gone, I might enjoy my lady's looks alone, yet honored still the moon with true intent, who taught us skill to work our will, and gave us place till all the night was spent. F.J. And now to return to my tale. By that time, that he returned out of the park, it was dinner time, and at dinner they all met. I mean both Dame Elinor, Dame Frances, and Fernando. I leave to describe that the Lady Frances was gorgeously attired, and set forth with very brave apparel, and Madame Elinor only in her nightgown girt to her, with a coif trimmed a la Piedmontese, on the which she wear a little cap crossed over the crown with two bands of yellow sarcenet or cypress, in the midst whereof she had placed, of her own handwriting, in paper this word, Contented. This attire pleased her then to use, and could not have displeased Mistress Frances, had she not been more privy to the cause, than to the thing itself. At least the Lord of the Castle, of ignorance, and Dame Frances of great temperance, let it passe without offence. At dinner, because the one was pleased with all former reckonings, and the other party privy to the account, there passed no word of taunt or grudge, but omnia bene. After dinner Dame Elinor, being no lesse desirous to have Ferdinando's company, then Dame Frances was to take him in some pretty trip, they began to question how they might best passe the day. The Lady Elinor seemed desirous to keep her chamber, but Mistress Frances, for another purpose, seemed desirous to ride abroad, thereby to take the open air. They agreed to ride a mile or twain for solace, and requested Ferdinando to accompany them, the which willingly granted. Each one parted from other to prepare themselves, and now began the sport, for when he was booted, his horses saddled, and he ready to ride, he gan miss his rapier, whereat all astonied he began to blame his man. but blame whom he would, found it could not be. At last the ladies going towards the horseback called for him in the base court, and demanded if he were ready. To whom he answered, Madam, I am more than ready, and yet not so ready as I would be. And immediately taking himself in trip, he thought best to utter no more of his conceit, but in haste more than good speed mounted his horse, and coming towards the dames presented himself, turning, bounding, and taking up his courser to the uttermost of his power in bravery. After suffering his horse to breathe himself, he gan to allay his own choler, and to the dames he said, Fair ladies, I am ready when it pleaseth you to ride whereso you command. How ready soever you be, servant, quod Dame Elinor, it seemeth your horse is readier at your command than at ours. If he be at my command, mistress, quod he shall be at yours. Gramercy, good servant, quod she, but my meaning is, that I fear he be too stirring for our company. If he prove so, mistress, quod he, I have here a soberer palfrey to serve you on. The dames being mounted, they rode forthwards by the space of a mile or very near, and Ferdinando, whether it were of his horse's courage or his own choler, came not so near them as they wished. At last the Lady Frances said unto him, Master Jeronimi, you said that you had a sober horse, which if it be so, we would be glad of your company, but I believe by your countenance your horse and you are agreed. Ferdinando alighting, called his servant, changed horses with him, and overtaking the dames, said to Mistress Frances, And why do you think, fair lady, that my horse and I are agreed? Because by your countenance, quod she, it seemeth your patience is stirred. In good faith, quod he, you have guessed aright, but not with any of you. Then we care the less, servant, quod Dame Elinor. By my troth, mistress, quod he, looking well about him that none might hear but they two, it is with my servant, who hath lost my sword out of my chamber. Dame Elinor, little remembering the occasion, replied, It is no matter, servant, quod she. You shall hear of it again, I warrant you, and presently we ride in Gods peace, and I trust shall have no need of it. Yet, mistress, quod he, a weapon serveth both uses, as well to defend as to offend. Now, by my troth, quod Dame Frances, I have now my dream, for I dreamt this night that I was in a pleasant meadow alone, where I met with a tall gentleman, apparelled in a nightgown of silk, all embroidered about with a guard of naked swords, and when he came towards me, I seemed to be afraid of him, but he recomforted me, saying, Be not afraid, fair lady, for I use this garment only for mine own defence, and in this sort went that warlike God Mars, what time he taught Dame Venus to make Vulcan a hammer of the new fashion. Notwithstanding these comfortable words, the fright of the dream awaked me, and sithens unto this hour I have not slept at all. And what time of the night dreamt you this, quod Ferdinando? In the grey morning, about dawning of the day. But why ask you, quod Dame Frances? Ferdinando with a great sigh answered, Because that dreames are to be marked more at some hour of the night than at some other. Why are you so cunning at the interpretation of dreames, servant, quod the Lady Elinor? Not very cunning, mistress, quod he, but guess like a young scholar. The dames continued in these and like pleasant talks, but Jeronimi could not be merry, as one that esteemed the preservation of his mistress' honour, no less than the obtaining of his own delights, and yet to avoid further suspicion, he repressed his passions as much as he could. The Lady Elinor, more careless than considerative of her own case, pricking forwards, said softly to him, I had thought you had received small cause, servant, to be thus dumpish, when I would be merry. Alas, dear mistress, quod he, it is altogether for your sake that I am pensive. Dame Frances of courtesy withdrew herself and gave them leave. when as Fernando declared unto his mistress, that his sword was taken out of his chamber, and that he dreaded much by the words of the Lady Frances, that she had some understanding of the matter. Dame Elinor now calling to remembrance what had passed the same night, at the first was abashed, but immediately, for these women be readily witted, cheered her servant, and willed him to commit unto her the salving of that sore. Thus they passed the rest of the way in pleasant talk with Dame Frances, and so returned towards the castle, where Jeronimi suffered the two dames to go together, and he alone unto his chamber to bewayle his own misgovernment. But Dame Elinor, whether it were according to old custome, or by wily policy, found meane that night that the sword was conveyed out of Mistress Frances' chamber, and brought unto hers, and after redelivery of it unto her servant, she warned him to be more wary from that time forthwards. Afterward, when he grew more bold and better acquainted with his mistress' disposition, he adventured one Friday in the morning to go unto her chamber, and thereupon wrote as followeth, which he termed a Friday's breakfast. That self same day, and of that day that hour, when she doth reign, that mocked Vulcan the smith, and thought it meet to harbour in her bower some gallant jest for her to dally with. That blessed hour, that blissed and happy day, I thought it meet with hasty steps to go unto the lodge wherein my lady lay, to laugh for joy, or else to weep for woe. And lo, my lady of her wonted grace, first lent her lips to me as for a kisse, and after that her body to embrace, wherein Dame Nature wrought nothing amisse. What followed next, guesse you that know the trade, for in this sort my Friday's feast I made. F.J. Many days passed these two lovers with great delight, their affaires being no less politically governed than happily atchieved. And surely it should seem in sad earnest, that he did not only love her, but was furthermore so ravished in ecstasies with continual remembrance of his delights, that he made an idol of her in his inward conceit. So seemed it by this challenge to beauty, which he wrote in his praise, and upon her name. Beauty, shut up thy shop, and trusse up all thy trash. My Nell hath stolne thy finest stuffe, and left thee in the lash. Thy market now is marred, thy gaines are gone God wot. Thou hast no ware that may compare with this that I have got. As for thy painted pale, and wrinkles circlet up, are deare enough for such as lust to drink of every cup. Thy body's bolstered out with bombast and with bags, thy rolls, thy ruffs, thy culls, thy coifes, thy jerkins, and thy jags, thy curling and thy cost, thy frisling and thy fair, to court with all those toys, and there set forth such ware, before their hungry eyes, that gaze on every jest, and choose the cheapest chaffer still to please their fancy best. But I, whose steadfast eyes could never cast a glance, with wandering look amid the presse, to take my choice by chance, have won by due desert a piece that hath no peer, and left the rest as refuse all to serve the market there. There let him choose that list, there catch the best who can. A painted blazing bait may serve to choke a gazing man. But I have slipped thy flour, that freshest is of hue. I have thy corn, go sell thy chaff, I list to seek no new. The windows of mine eyes are glazed with such delight, as each new face seems full of faults that blazeth in my sight. And not without just cause, I can compare her so. Lo here my glove, I challenge him that can or dare say no. Let Theseus come with club, or Paris brag with brand, to prove how fair their Helen was, that scourged the Grecian land. Let mighty Mars himself come armed to the field, and vaunt Dame Venus to defend, with helmet, spear, and shield, this hand that had good hap, my Helen to embrace, shall have like luck to foil her foes, and daunt them with disgrace, and cause them to confesse, by verdict and by oath, how far her lovely lookes do staine the beauties of them both, and that my Helen is more fair than Paris' wife, and doth deserve more famous praise than Venus for her life. Which if I not performe, my life then let me leese, or else be bound in chaines of change, to beg for beauties fees. F.J. By this challenge I guesse that either he was then in an ecstasie, or else sure I am now in a lunacie, for it is a proud challenge made to Beauty her selfe, and all her companions, and imagining that Beauty having a shop, where she uttered her wares of all sundry sorts, his lady had stolen the finest away, leaving none behind her, but painting, bolstring, horsing, and such like, the which in his rage he judgeth good enough to serve the court, and thereupon grew a great quarrel. When these verses were by the negligence of his mistress dispersed into sundry hands, and so at last to the reading of a courtier, well, Ferdinando had his desire, if his mistress liked them, but as Bartello writeth, she grew in jealousy, that the same were not written by her, because her name was Elinor and not Helen. And about this point have been diverse and sundry opinions among the Venetians, for this and divers other of his most notable poems have come to view of the world. And some have attributed this praise unto a Helen, who deserved not so well as this Dame Elinor should seem to deserve, and yet never a barrel of good herring between them both, but that other Helen, because she was, saith Bartello, of so base conditions, as may deserve no manner commendation in any honest judgment. Therefore he thinketh that he would never bestow verse of so mean a subject. And yet some of his acquaintance, knowing also that he was sometimes acquainted with Helen, have stood in argument that it was written by Helen and not by Elinor. Well, mine author affirmeth that it was written by this Dame Elinor, and that unto her he thus alledged that he took it all for one name, or at least he never read of any Elinor such matter as might sound worthy like commendation for beauty. And indeed, considering all circumstances of histories, and comparing also the time that such reports do spread of his acquaintance with Helen, it cannot be written less than 6 or 7 years before he knew Helen. Marry, peradventure, if there were any acquaintance between him and that Helen afterwards, he might adapt it to her name, and so make it serve both their turns, as elder lovers have done before, and still do, and will do world without end. Well, by whom he wrote it I know not, and to return to the purpose, he sought more certainly to please his mistress Elinor with this sonnet written in her praise as followeth. The stately dames of Rome their pearls did wear about their neckes to beautify their name, but she whom I do serve, her pearls doth bear close in her mouth, and smiling shew the same. No wonder then, though every word she speakes a jewel seeme in judgment of the wise, since that her sugared tongue the passage breakes between two rocks bedecked with pearls of price. Her haire of gold, her front of ivory, a bloody heart within so white a breast, her teeth of pearl, lips ruby, crystal eye. Needs must I honor her above the rest, since she is formed of none other mould, but ruby, crystal, ivory, pearl, and gold. Fernando Jeronimi. Of this sonnet, were it not a little too much praise, as the Italians do most commonly offend in the superlative, I could the more commend it, but I hope the party, to whom it was dedicated, had rather it were much more, than any thing less. End of page 6. Page 7 of The Adventures of Master F.J. by George Gascoigne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Well, thus these two lovers passed many days in exceeding contentation, and more than speakable pleasures, in which time Fernando did compile very many verses according to sundry occasions proffered, and they were for the most part sauced with a taste of glory, as you know that in such cases a lover being charged with inexprimable joys, and therewith enjoined both by duty and discretion to keep the same covert, can by no means devise a greater consolation than to commit it into some ciphered words and figured speeches in verse, whereby he feeleth his heart half, or more than half, eased of swelling. For as sighs are some present ease to the pensive mind, even so we find by experience, that such secret intercommonings of joys doth increase delight. I would not have you conster my words to this effect, that I think a man cannot sufficiently rejoice in the lucky lots of love, unless he impart the same to others. God forbid that ever I should enter into such an heresy, for I have always been of this opinion, that as to be fortunate in love is one of the most inward contentations to man's mind of all earthly joys. Even so, if he do but once bewray the same to any living creature, immediately either dread of discovering doth bruise his breast with an intolerable burden, or else he leaseth the principal virtue which gave effect to his gladness, not unlike to apothecary's pot, which being filled with sweet ointments or perfumes, doth retain in itself some scent of the same, and being poured out doth return to the former state, hard, harsh, and of small savour. So the mind being fraught with delights, as long as it can keep them secretly enclosed, may continually feed upon the pleasant record thereof, as the well willing and ready horse biteth on the bridle. But having once disclosed them to any other, straightway we lose the hidden treasure of the same, and are oppressed with sundry doubtful opinions and dreadful conceits. And yet for a man to record unto himself in the inward contemplation of his mind, the often remembrance of his late received joys, doth as it were ease the heart of burden, and add unto the mind a fresh supply of delight. Yea, and in verse principally, as I conceive, a man may best contrive his way of comfort in himself. Therefore, as I have said, Fernando, swimming now in delights, did nothing but write such verse as might accumulate his joys to the extremity of pleasure, the which for that purpose he kept from sight of the world, as one more desirous to seem obscure and defective than overmuch to glory in his adventures, especially for that in the end his hap was as heavy as hitherto he had been fortunate. Footnote: Q1 contains this. Amongst other, I remembered one happened upon this occasion, the husband of the Lady Elinor, being all the while absent from her, gan now return, and kept cut at home, with whom F.J. found means so to insinuate himself, that familiarity took deep root between them, and seldom but by stealth you could find the one out of the other's company. On a time, the knight riding on hunting desired F.J. to accompany him, the which he could not refuse to do, but like a lusty younker, ready at all assays, apparelled himself in green, and about his neck a bugle, pricking and galloping amongst the foremost, according to the manner of that country. And it chanced that the married knight, thus galloping, lost his horn, which some divines might have interpreted to be but molting, and that by God's grace he might have a new come up again shortly instead of that. Well, he came to F.J. requiring him to lend him his bugle, for, said the knight, I heard you not blow this day, and I would fain encourage the hounds if I had a horn. Quod F.J., although I have not been over lavish of my coming hitherto, I would you should not doubt but that I can tell how to use a horn well enough, and yet I may little do if I may not lend you a horn. And therewithal took his bugle from his neck, and lent it to the knight, who making it unto the hounds, gan assay to recheat, but the horn was too hard for him to wind, whereat F.J. took pleasure, and said to himself, blow till thou break that. I made thee one within these few days, that thou wilt never crack whiles thou livest. And hereupon, before the fall of the buck, devised this sonnet following, which at his homecoming he presented unto his mistress. G.T. As some men say, there is a kind of seed will grow to horns if it be sowed thick, wherewith I thought to try if I could breed a brood of buds well sharped on the prick, and by good proof of learned skill I found, as on some special soil all seeds best frame, so jealous brains do breed the battle ground, that best of all might serve to bear the same. Then sought I forth to find such supple soil, and called to mind thy husband had a brain, so that per case by travail and by toil, his fruitful front might turn my seed to gain. And as I groped in that ground to sow it, start up a horn, thy husband could not blow it. F.J. This sonnet treateth of a strange seed, but it tasteth most of rye, which is more common amongst men nowadays. Well, let it pass amongst the rest, and he that liketh it not, turn over the leaf to another. I doubt not but in this register he may find some to content him, unless he be too curious. End of footnote. And here I will surcease to rehearse any more of his verses, until I have expressed how that his joys, being exalted to the highest degree, began to bend toward declination. For now the unhappy secretary, whom I have before remembred, was returned from Florence, on whom Fernando had no sooner cast his eyes, but immediately he fell into a great passion of mind, which might be compared unto a fever. This fruit grew of the good instructions that his hope had planted in his mind, whereby I might take just occasion to forewarn every lover, how they suffer this venomous serpent jealousy to creep into their conceits. For surely, of all other diseases in love, I suppose that to be uncurable, and would hold longer discourse therein, were it not that both this tale and the verses of Fernando himself, hereafter to be recited, shall be sufficient to speak for me in this behalf. The lover, as I say, upon the sudden was driven into such a malady, as no meat might nourish his body, no delights please his mind, no remembrance of joys forepast content him, nor any hope of the like to come might recomfort him. Hereat, some unto whom I have imparted this tale, have taken occasion to discommend his fainting heart, yet surely the cause inwardly and deeply considered, I cannot so lightly condemn him, for an old saying is, that every man can give counsel better than follow it, and needs must the conflicts of his thoughts be strange, between the remembrance of his forepast pleasure, and the present sight of this monster, whom before, for lack of like instruction, he had not so thoroughly marked and beheld. Well, such was the grief unto him, that he became sickly and kept his chamber. The ladies having received the news thereof, gan all at once lament his misfortune, and of common consent agreed to visit him. They marched thither in good equipage, I warrant you, and found Fernando lying upon his bed languishing, whom they all saluted generally, and sought to recomfort, but especially his mistress, having in her hand a branch of willow, wherewith she defended her from the hot air, gan thus say unto him, Servant, quod she, or that I suppose your malady to proceed of none other cause but only slothfulness, I have brought this pretty rod to beat you a little, nothing doubting but when you feel the smart of a twig or twain, you will, like a tractable young scholar, pluck up your quickened spirits, and cast this drowsiness apart. Fernando, with a great sigh, answered, Alas, good mistress, quod he, if any like chastisement might quicken me, how much more might the presence of all you lovely dames recomfort my dulled mind, whom to behold were sufficient to revive an eye now dazzled with the dread of death, and that not only for the heavenly aspects which you represent, but also much the more for your exceeding courtesy, in that you have deigned to visit me, so unworthy a servant. But, good mistress, quod he, as it were shame for me to confess that ever my heart could yield for fear, so I assure you that my mind cannot be content to induce infirmity by sluggish conceit. But in truth, mistress, I am sick, quod he, and therewithal the trembling of his heart had sent up such throbbing into his throat, as that his voice, now deprived of breath, commanded the tongue to be still, when Dame Elinor for compassion distilled into tears, and drew towards the window, leaving the other gentlewomen about his bed, who being no less sorry for his grief, yet for that they were none of them so touched in their secret thoughts, they had bolder spirits and freer speech to recomfort him. Amongst the rest, the Lady Frances, who indeed loved him deeply, and could best conjecture the cause of his conceits, said unto him, Good trust, quod she, if any help of physic may cure your malady, I would not have you hurt yourself with these doubts which you seem to retain. If choice of diet may help, behold us here, your cooks, ready to minister all things needful. If company may drive away your annoy, we mean not to leave you solitary. If grief of mind be cause of your infirmity, we all here will offer our devoir to turn it into joy. If mishap have given you cause to fear or dread anything, remember hope, which never faileth to recomfort an afflicted mind. And good trust, quod she, distraining his hand right heartily, let this simple proof of our poor good wills be so accepted of you, as that it may work thereby the effect of our desires. Fernando, as one in a trance, had marked very little of her courteous talk, and yet gave her thanks, and so held his peace, whereat the ladies being all amazed, there became a silence in the chamber on all sides. Dame Elinor fearing thereby that she might the more easily be espied, and having now dried up her tears, returned to her servant, recomforting him by all possible means of common courtesy, promising that since in her sickness he had not only stanched her bleeding, but also by his gentle company and sundry devices of honest pastime, had driven away the pensiveness of her mind, she thought herself bound with like willingness to do her best in anything that might restore his health, and taking him by the hand, said further, Good servant, if thou bear indeed any true affection to thy poor mistress, start upon thy feet again, and let her enjoy thine accustomed service to her comfort. For sure, quod she, I will never leave to visit this chamber once in a day, until I may have thee down with me. Fernando, hearing the hearty words of his mistress, and perceiving the earnest manner of her pronunciation, began to receive unspeakable comfort in the same, and said, Mistress, your exceeding courtesy were able to revive a man half dead, and to me it is both great comfort, and it doth also scald my remembrance with a continual smart of mine own unworthiness. But as I would desire no longer life, than till I might be able to deserve some part of your bounty, so I will endeavour myself to live, were it but only unto that end, that I might merit some part of your favour with acceptable service, and requite some deal of the courtesy of all these other fair ladies, who have so far, above my deserts, deigned to do me good. Thus said, the ladies tarried not long before they were called to evensong, when his mistress taking his hand, kissed it, saying, Farewell, good servant, and I pray thee suffer not the malice of thy sickness to overcome the gentleness of thy good heart. Fernando, ravished with joy, suffered them all to depart, and was not able to pronounce one word. After their departure, he gan cast in his mind the exceeding courtesy used towards him by them all, but above all other the bounty of his mistress. and therewithal took a sound and firm opinion that it was not possible for her to counterfeit so deeply, as indeed I believe that she then did not, whereby he suddenly felt his heart greatly eased, and began in himself thus to reason. Was ever man of so wretched a heart? I am the most bounden to love, quod he, of all them that ever professed his service. I enjoy one the fairest that ever was found, and I find her the kindest that ever was heard of. Yet in mine own wicked heart, I could villainously conceive that of her, which being compared with the rest of her virtues, is not possible to harbour in so noble a mind. Hereby I have brought myself without cause into this feebleness, and good reason that for so high an offence I should be punished with great infirmity. What shall I then do? Yield to the same? No, but according to my late protestation, I will recomfort this languishing mind of mine, to the end I may live but only to do penance for this so notable a crime so rashly committed. And thus saying, he started from his bed, and gan to walk towards the window. But the venomous serpent which, as before I rehearsed, had stung him, could not be content that these medicines applied by the mouth of his gentle mistress should so soon restore him to garrison. And although indeed they were such mithridate to him as that they had now expelled the rancour of the poison, yet that ugly hellish monster had left behind her in the most secret of his bosom, even between the mind and the man, one of her familiars, named Suspect, which gan work in the weak spirits of Fernando effects of no less peril than before he had received. His head swelling with these troublesome toys, and his heart swimming in the tempests of tossing fantasy, he felt his legs so feeble that he was constrained to lie down on his bed again, and repeating in his own remembrance every word that his mistress had spoken unto him, he gan to dread that she had brought the willow branch to beat him with, in token that he was of her forsaken. For so lovers do most commonly expound the willow garland, and this to think did cut his heart in twain. A wonderful change! And here a little to stay you, I will describe as I find it in Bartello the beginning, the fall, the return, and the being of this hellish bird, who indeed may well be counted a very limb of the devil. Many years since, one of the most dreadful dastards in the world, and one of them that first devised to wear his beard at length, lest the barber might do him a good turn sooner than he looked for it, and yet not so soon as he deserved, had builded for his security a pile on the highest and most inaccessible mount of all his territories, the which being fortified with strong walls, and environed with deep ditches, had no place of entry, but one only door so strait and narrow, as might by any possibility receive the body of one living man, from which he ascended up a ladder, and so creeping through a marvellous strait hole, attained to his lodging, the which was so dark and obscure, as scarcely either sun or air could enter into it. Thus he devised to lodge in safety, and for the most surety gan trust none other letting down this ladder, but only his wife, and at the foot thereof kept always by daylight a fierce mastiff close enkennelled, which never saw nor heard the face or voice of any other creature, but only of them two. Him by night he trusted with the scout of this pretty passage, having nevertheless between him and this dog a double door with treble locks, quadruple bars, and before all a portcullis of iron. Neither yet could he be so hardy as to sleep until he had caused a guard of servants, whom he kept abroad for that purpose, to search all the corners adjoining to all his fortress, and then between fearful sweat and shivering cold, with one eye opened and the other closed, he stole sometimes a broken sleep, divided with many terrible dreams. In this sort the wretch lived all too long, until at last his wife, being not able any longer to support this hellish life, grew so hardy, as with his own knife to dispatch his carcass out of this earthly purgatory. the which being done, his soul, and good reason, was quickly conveyed by Charon unto hell. There Rhadamanthus, judge of that bench, commanded him quickly to be thrust into a boiling pool, and being therein plunged very often, he never shrieked or cried, I scald, as his other companions there cried, but seemed so lightly to esteem it, that the judge thought meet to condemn him unto the most terrible place, where are such torments as neither pen can write, tongue express, or thought conceive. But the miser, even there, seemed to smile, and to make small account of his punishment. Rhadamanthus, hereof informed, sent for him, and demanded the cause why he made so light of his durance. He answered, that whiles he lived on earth, he was so continually afflicted and oppressed with suspicion, as that now, only to think that he was out of those meditations, was sufficient armour to defend him from all other torments. Rhadamanthus, astonied hereat, gan call together the senators of that kingdom, and propounded this question, how and by what punishment they might devise to touch him according to his deserts. And hereupon fell great disputation, at last being considered, that he had already him plunged in the most unspeakable torments, and thereat little or nothing had changed countenance, therewithal that no soul was sent unto them to be relieved of his smart, but rather to be punished for his former delights. It was concluded by the general council, that he should be eftsoons sent into the world and restored to the same body wherein he first had his residence, so to remain for perpetuity, and never to depart nor to perish. Thus the body and soul being once again united, and now eftsoons with the same pestilence infected, he became of a suspicious man, suspicion itself. And now the wretch, remembering the treason of his wife, who had so willingly dispatched him once before, gan utterly abhor her, and fled her company, searching in all countries some place of better assurance. And when he had in vain trod over the most part of the earth, he embarked himself to find some unknown island, wherein he might frame some new habitation, and finding none so commodious as he desired, he fortuned, sailing alone by the shore, to espy a rock, more than 600 cubits high, which hung so suspiciously over the seas, as though it would threaten to fall at every little blast. This did suspicion imagine to be a fit foundation whereon he might build his second bower. He forsook his boat, and travelled by land to espy what entry or access might be made unto the same, and found from land no manner of entry or access, unless it were that some courteous bird of the air would be ambassador, or convey some engines, as whilome the eagle did carry Ganymede into heaven. He then returned to seas, and approaching near to this rock, found a small stream of fresh water issuing out of the same into the seas, the which, although it were so little and so straight as might uneaths receive a boat of bigness to carry one living creature at once, yet in his conceit he thought it more large and spacious than that Broadway called by our forefathers Via Appia, or than that other named Flaminia. He abandoned his bark, and putting off his clothes, adventured, for he was now assured not to drown, to wade and swim against the stream of this unknown brook, the which, a wondrous thing to tell, and scarcely to be believed, came down from the very top and height of this rock, and by the way he found 6 straits and dangerous places, where the water seemed to stay his course, passing under 6 straight and low bridges, and hard by every one of those places a pile raised up in manner of a bulwark, the which were hollow, in such sorts as lodgings and other places necessary might in them commodiously be devised by such one as could endure the hellishness of the place. Passing by these, he attained with much pain unto the top of the rock, the which he found hollowed as the rest, and far more fit for his security, than otherwise apt for any commodity. there gan suspicion determined to nestle himself, and having now placed 6 chosen porters, to wit, dread, mistrust, wrath, desperation, frenzy, and fury, at these 6 strong bulwarks, he lodged himself in that 7th all alone, for he trusted no company, but ever mistrusting that his wife should eftsoons find him out therein, he shrieketh continually, like to a shriek-owl, to keep the watch waking, never content to sleep by day nor by night, but to be sure that he should not oversleep himself, gan stuff his couch with porpentines quills, to the end that when heavy sleep overcame him, and he thereby should be constrained to charge his pallet with more heavy burden, those plumes might then prick through and so awake him. His garments were steel upon iron, and that iron upon iron, and iron again, and the more he was armed, the less he trusted to be out of danger. He chopped and changed continually, now this, now that, now keys, now locks, ditches, new scoured, and walls newly fortified, and thus always uncontented liveth this wretched hellhound Suspicion, in this hellish dungeon of habitation, from whence he never removeth his foot, but only in the dead and silent nights, when he may be assured that all creatures but himself are whelmed in sound sleep, and then with stealing steps he stalketh about the earth, infecting, tormenting, and vexing all kinds of people with some part of his afflictions, but especially such as either do sit in chair of greatest dignity and estimation, or else such as have achieved some dear and rare emprise. Those above all others he continually galleth with fresh wounds of dread, lest they might lose and forego the rooms whereunto with such long travail and good haps they had attained. And by this means per case he had crept into the bosom of Fernando, who, as is before declared, did erst swim in the deepest seas of earthly delights. Now then I must think it high time to return unto him, who, being now through feebleness eftsoons cast down upon his bed, gan cast in his inward meditations all things past, and as one thoroughly puffed up and filled with one peevish conceit, could think upon nothing else, and yet accusing his own guilty conscience to be infected with jealousy, did compile this as followeth. What state to man so sweet and pleasant weare, as to be tied in linkes of worthy love? What life so blist and happy might appear, as for to serve Cupid, that God above? If that our minds were not sometimes infect with dread, with fear, with care, with cold suspect, with deep despair, with furious frenesy, handmaids to her whom we call jealousy, for every other sop of sour chance, which lovers taste amid their sweet delight, increaseth joy, and doth their love advance, in pleasures place to have more perfect plight. The thirsty mouth thinks water hath good taste, the hungry jaws are pleased with each repast. Who hath not proved what dearth by wars doth grow, cannot of peace the pleasant plenties know. And though with eye we see not every joy, yet may the mind full well support the same. An absent life long led in great annoy, when presence comes, doth turn from grief to game. To serve without reward is thought great pain, but if despair do not therewith remain, it may be borne for right rewards at last. Follow true service, though they come not fast. Disdains, repulses, finally each ill, each smart, each pain of love, each bitter taste, to think on them gan frame the lovers will, to like each joy the more that comes at last. But this infernal plague, if once it touch, or venom once the lover's mind with grutch, all fests and joys that afterwards befall, the lover counts them light or not at all. This is that sore, this is that poisoned wound, the which to heal, nor salve, nor ointment serve, nor charm of words, nor image can be found, nor observance of stars can it preserve, nor all the art of magic can prevail, which Zoroastes found for our avail. Or cruel plague, above all sorrows smart, with desperate death thou slay'st the lover's heart. And me, even now, thy gall hath so infect, as all the joys which ever lover found, and all good haps that ever Troilus sect, achieved yet above the luckless ground, can never sweeten once my mouth with mel, nor bring my thoughts again in rest to dwell. Of thy mad moods, and of naught else I think, in such like seas fair Bradamant did sink. Fernando Jeronimi. Thus Fernando continued on his bed, until his bountiful mistress, with the company of the other courteous dames, returned after supper to his chamber. At their first entry, "Why, how now, servant," quod Dame Elinor, "we hoped to have found you on foot." "Mistress," quod he, "I have assayed my feet since your departure, but I find them yet unable to support my heavy body, and therefore am constrained, as you see, to acquaint myself with these pillows." "Servant," said she, "I am right sorry thereof, but since it is of necessity to bear sickness, I will employ my endeavour to allay some part of your pains, and to refresh your weary limbs with some comfortable matter." And therewithal, calling her handmaid, delivered unto her a bunch of pretty little keys, and whispering in her ear, dispatched her towards her chamber. The maid tarried not long, but returned with a little casket, the which her mistress took, opened, and drew out of the same much fine linen, amongst the which she took a pillow bare, very fine and sweet, which although it were of it self as sweet as might be, being of long time kept in that odoriferous chest, yet did she with damask water, and that of the best that might be, I warrant you, all to sprinkle it with her own hands, which in my conceit might much amend the matter. Then calling for a fresh pillow, sent her maid to aire the same, and at her return put on this thus perfumed pillow bare. In mean time also she with her own hands attired her servant's head in a fair wrought kerchief, taken out of the same casket, then laid him down upon this fresh and pleasant place, and prettily, as it were in sport, bedewed his temples with sweet water, which she had ready in a casting bottle of gold, kissing his cheek and saying, "Good servant, be whole, for I might not long endure thus to attend thee, and yet the love that I bear towards thee cannot be content to see thee languish." "Mistress," said Fernando, and that with a trembling voice, "assure yourself, that if there remain in me any spark of life or possibility of recovery, then may this excellent bounty of yours be sufficient to revive me without any further travail or pain unto your person. For whom I am highly to blame, in that I do not spare to put you unto this trouble, and better it were that such a wretch as I had died unknown, than that by your exceeding courtesy you should fall into any malady, either by resorting unto me, or by these your pains taken about me." "Servant," quod she, "all pleasures seeme painfull to them that take no delight therein, and likewise all toyle seemeth pleasant to such as set their felicity in the same. But for me, be you sure, I do it with so good a will, that I can take no hurt thereby, unless I shall perceive that it be rejected or neglected, as unprofitable or uncomfortable unto you. To me, mistress," quod Fernando, "it is such pleasure, as neither my feeble tongue can express, nor my troubled mind conceive." "Why, are you troubled in mind then, servant?" quod Dame Elinor. Fernando, now blushing, answered, But even as all sick men be, mistress, herewith they stayed their talk a while, and the first that brake silence was the Lady Frances, who said, and to drive away the troubles of your mind, good Trust, I would be glad if we could devise some pastime amongst us to keep you company. For I remember that with such devices you did greatly recomfort this fair lady when she languished in like sort. She languished indeed, gentle Hope, quod he, but God forbid that she had languished in like sort. Every body thinketh their own grief greatest, quod Dame Elinor. But indeed, whether my grief were the more or the less, I am right sorry that yours is such as it is. And to assay whether our passions proceeded of like cause or not, I would we could, according to this lady's saying, devise some like pastime to try if your malady would be cured with like medicines. A gentlewoman of the company, whom I have not hitherto named, gan thus propound. We have accustomed, quod she, heretofore in most of our games to choose a king or queen, and he or she, during their government, have charged every of us, either with commandments or questions, as best seemed to their majesty. Wherein, to speak mine opinion, we have given over large a scope, neither seemeth it reasonable that one should have the power to discover the thoughts, or at least to bridle the affects of all the rest. And though indeed in questioning, which doth of the twain more nearly touch the mind, every one is at free liberty to answer what they list, yet oft have I heard a question demanded in such sort, and upon such sudden, that it hath been hardly answered without moving matter of contention. And in commands also, sometimes it happeneth, one to be commanded unto such service, as either they are unfit to accomplish, and then the parties weakness is thereby detected, or else to do something that they would not, whereof ensueth more grouch than game. Wherefore in mine opinion, we shall do well to choose by lot amongst us a governor, who, for that it shall be sufficient preeminence to use the chair of majesty, shall be bound to give sentence upon all such arguments and questions as we shall orderly propound unto them. And from him or her, as from an oracle, we will receive answer, and deciding of our litigious causes. This dame had stuff in her, an old courtier, and a wily wench, named Pergo. Well, this proposition of Pergo pleased them well, and by lot it happened that Fernando must be moderator of these matters, and collector of these causes. The which being so constituted, the Lady Elinor said unto this Dame Pergo, You have devised this pastime, quod she, and because we think you to be the most expert in the handling thereof, do you propound the first question, and we shall be both the more ready and able to follow your example. The Lady Pergo refused not, but began on this wise. Noble Governor, quod she, amongst the adventures that have befallen me, I remember especially this one, that in youth it was my chance to be beloved of a very court-like young gentleman, who abode near the place wherein my parents had their residence. This gentleman, whether it were for beauty, or for any other respect that he saw in me, I know not, but he was enamored of me, and that with an exceeding vehement passion, and of such force were his effects, that notwithstanding many repulses which he had received at my hands, he seemed daily to grow in the renewing of his desires. I, on the other side, although I could by no means mislike of him by any good reason, considering that he was of birth no way inferior unto me, of possessions not to be disdained, of person right comely, of behaviour courtly, of manners modest, of mind liberal, and of virtuous disposition, yet such was the gaiety of my mind, as that I could not be content to lend him over large thongs of my love, but always dangerously behaved myself towards him, and in such sort as he could neither take comfort of my answers, nor yet once find himself requited with one good look for all his travail. This notwithstanding, the worthy knight continued his suit with no less vehement affection than erst he had begun it, even by the space of 7 years. At the last, whether discomfited by my dealings, or tried by long travail, or that he had percase lit upon the lake that is in the forest of Ardennes, and so in haste and all thirsty had drunk some drops of disdain, whereby his hot flames were quenched, or that he had undertaken to serve no longer but his just term of apprenticehood, or that the teeth of time had gnawen and tired his dulled spirits in such sort as that all benumbed he was constrained to use some other artificial balm for the quickening of his senses, or by what cause moved I know not, he did not only leave his long continued suit, but as I have since perceived, grew to hate me more deadly than before I had disdained him. At the first beginning of his retire, I perceived not his hatred, but imagined that, being overwearied, he had withdrawn himself for a time. And considering his worthiness, therewithal his constancy of long time proved, I thought, that I could not in the whole world find out a fitter match to bestow myself, than on so worthy a person. Wherefore I did by all possible means procure that he might eftsoons use his accustomed repaire unto my parents. And further, in all places where I happened to meet him, I used all the courtesies towards him that might be contained within the bonds of modesty. But all was in vain, for he was now become more dangerous to be won than the haggard falcon. Our lots being thus unluckily changed, I grew to burn in desire, and the more dangerous that he showed himself unto me, the more earnest I was by all means to procure his consent of love. At the last I might perceive that not only he disdained me, but as me thought, boiled in hatred against me. And the time that I thus continued tormented with these thoughts was also just the space of 7 years. Finally, when I perceived no remedy for my perplexities, I essayed by absence to wear away this malady, and therefore utterly refused to come in his presence, yea, or almost in any other company, whereby I have consumed in lost time the flower of my youth, and am become, as you see, what with years and what with the tormenting passions of love, pale, wan, and full of wrinkles. Nevertheless, I have thereby gained thus much, that at last I have wound myself clear out of Cupid's chains, and remain careless at liberty. Now mark to what end I tell you this. First, 7 years passed, in the which I could never be content to yield unto his just desires. Next, other 7 years I spent in seeking to recover his lost love. And sithens both those 7 years, there are even now on St. Valentine's day last, other 7 years past, in the which neither I have desired to see him, nor he hath coveted to hear of me. My parents now perceiving how the crow's foot is crept under mine eye, and remembering the long suit that this gentleman had in youth spent on me, considering therewith all that green youth is well mellowed in us both, have of late sought to persuade a marriage between us, the which the knight hath not refused to hear of, and I have not disdained to think on. By their mediation we have been eftsoons brought to parley, wherein over and besides the ripping up of many old griefs, this hath been chiefly rehearsed and objected between us, what wrong and injury each of us hath done to other. And hereabouts we have fallen to sharp contention. He alleged that much greater is the wrong which I have done unto him, than that repulse which he hath sithens used to me, and I have affirmed the contrary. The matter yet hangeth in variance. Now of you, worthy Governor, I would be most glad to hear this question decided, remembering that there was no difference in the times between us. And surely, unless your judgment help me, I am afraid my marriage will be marred, and I may go lead apes in hell. Ferdinando answered, Good Pergo, I am sorry to hear so lamentable a discourse of your luckless love, and much the sorrier, in that I must needs give sentence against you. For surely great was the wrong that either of you have done to other, and greater was the needless grief which causeless each of you hath conceived in this long time. But greatest in my judgment hath been both the wrong and the grief of the knight, in that notwithstanding his deserts, which yourself confess, he never enjoyed any guerdon of love at your hands. And you, as you allege, did enjoy his love of long time together, so that by the reckoning it will fall out, although being blinded in your own conceit you see it not, that of the 21 years you enjoyed his love 7 at the least, but that ever he enjoyed yours we cannot perceive. And much greater is the wrong that rewardeth evil for good, than that which requireth tip for tap. Further, it seemeth that whereas you went about in time to try him, you did altogether lose time which can never be recovered, and not only lost your own time, whereof you would seem now to lament, but also compelled him to lose his time, which he might, be it spoken without offence to you, have bestowed in some other worthy place. And therefore, as that grief is much greater which hath no kind of comfort to allay it, so much more is that wrong which altogether without cause is offered. And I, said Pergo, must needs think, that much easier is it for them to endure grief which never tasted of joy, and much less is that wrong which is so willingly proffered to be by recompense restored. For if this knight will confess that he never had cause to rejoice in all the time of his service, then with better contentation might he abide grief than I, who having tasted of the delight which I did secretly conceive of his deserts, do think each grief a present death, by the remembrance of those forepast thoughts. And less wrong seemeth it to be destitute of the thing which were never obtained, than to be deprived of a jewel whereof we have been already possessed. So that under your correction I might conclude, that greater hath been my grief and injury sustained than that of the knight. To whom Jeronimi replied, As touching delight, it may not be denied but that every lover doth take delight in the inward contemplation of his mind, to think of the worthiness of his beloved. And therefore you may not allege that the knight had never cause to rejoice, unless you will altogether condemn yourself of worthiness. Marry, if you will say that he tasted not the delights that lovers seek, then mark, who was the cause but yourself? And if you would accuse him of like ingratitude, for that he disdained you in the later 7 years, when as he might by accepting your love have recompensed himself of all former wrongs, you must remember therewithal, that the cruelty by you showed towards him was such that he could by no means perceive that your change proceeded of good will, but rather eftsoons to hold him enchained in unknown links of subtle dealings, and therefore not without cause he doubted you, and yet without cause you rejected him. He had often sought occasion, but by your refusals he could never find him. You having occasion fast by the foretop, did dally with him so long, till at the last he slipped his head from you, and then catching at the bald noddle, you found yourself the cause, and yet you would accuse another. To conclude, greater is the grief that is sustained without desert, and much more is the wrong that is offered without cause. Thus Fernando Jeronimi decided the question propounded by Pergo, and expected that some other dame should propound another. But his mistress, having her hand on another halfpenny, gan thus say unto him: Servant, this pastime is good, and such as I must needs like of, to drive away your pensive thoughts. But sleeping time approacheth, and I fear we disquiet you. Wherefore the rest of this time we will, if so like you, bestow in trimming up your bed, and to morrow we shall meet here and renew this new begun game with Madame Pergo. Mistress, quod he, I must obey your will, and most humbly thank you of your great goodness, and all these ladies for their courtesy. Even so requiring you that you will no further trouble yourselves about me, but let my servant alone with conducting me to bed. Yes, servant, quod she, I will see if you can sleep any better in my sheets. And therewith commanded her handmaid to fetch a pair of clean sheets, the which being brought, marvellous fine and sweet, the ladies Frances and Elinor did courteously unfold them, and laid them on the bed, which done, they also entreated him to unclothe him, and go to bed. End of page 7. Page 8 of The Adventures of Master F.J. by George Gascoigne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Yes, servant, quod she, I will see if you can sleep any better in my sheets. And therewith commanded her handmaid to fetch a pair of clean sheets, the which being brought, marvellous fine and sweet, the ladies Frances and Elinor did courteously unfold them, and laid them on the bed, which done, they also entreated him to unclothe him and go to bed. Being laid, his mistress dressed and couched the clothes about him, sithens moistened his temples with rose water, gave him handkerchiefs and other fresh linen about him, and doing whereof she whispered in his ear, saying, Servant, this night I will be with thee, and after with the rest of the dames gave him good night and departed, leaving him in a trance between hope and despair, trust and mistrust. Thus he lay ravished, commanding his servant to go to bed, and feigning that himself would assay if he could sleep. About 10 or 11 of the clock came his mistress in her nightgown, who knowing all privy ways in that house very perfectly, had conveyed herself into his chamber, unseen and unperceived, and being now come unto his bedside, kneeled down, and laying her arm over him, said these or like words: My good servant, if thou knewest what perplexities I suffer in beholding of thine infirmities, it might then suffice, either utterly to drive away the malady, or much more to augment thy griefs. For I know thou lovest me, and I think also that thou hast had sufficient proof of mine unfeigned goodwill, in remembrance whereof I fall into sundry passions. First I count the happy lots of our first acquaintance, and therein I call to mind the equality of our affections. For I think that there were never two lovers conjoined with freer consent on both parties. And if my over hasty delivery of yielding words be not rested hereafter to my condemnation, I can then assure myself to escape for ever without desert of any reproof. Herewithal I cannot forget the sundry adventures happened since we became one heart divided in two bodies, all which have been both happily achieved, and delectably enjoyed. What resteth then to consider but this thy present state, the first corrosive that I have felt, and the last cordial that I look for, the end of my joys, and the beginning of my torments. And here her salt tears gan bathe the dying lips of her servant, who hearing these words, and well considering her demeanour, began now to accuse himself of such and so heinous treason, as that his guilty heart was constrained to yield unto a just scourge for the same. He swooned under her arm, the which when she perceived, it were hard to tell what fears did most affright her. And it were hard now to rehearse how he was revived, since there were none present but he dying, who could not declare, and she living, who would not disclose so much as I mean to bewray. For mine author deemeth it Ferdinando returning to life. The first which he felt was that his good mistress lay pressing his breast with the whole weight of her body, and biting his lips with her friendly teeth, and peradventure she refrained, either of courtesy towards him, or for womanish fear, to hurt her tender hand, to strike him on the cheekes in such sort as they do that strive to call again a dying creature, and therefore thought this the aptest meane to reduce him unto remembrance. Ferdinando, now awaked, could no lesse do than of his courteous nature receive his mistresse into his bed, who, as one that knew that way better than how to help his swooning, gan gently strip off her clothes, and lovingly embraced him, gan demand of him in this sort: Alas, good servant, quod she, what kind of malady is this that so extremely doth torment thee? Jeronimi with fainting speech answered, Mistresse, as for my malady, it hath been easily cured by your bountifull medicines applied, but I must confesse, that in receiving that garrison at your hands, I have been constrained to fall into an ecstasie, through the galling remembrance of mine own unworthinesse. Neverthelesse, good mistresse, since I perceive such fidelity remaining between us, as that few words will perswade such trust as lovers ought to embrace, let these few words suffice to crave your pardon, and do eftsoons pour upon me, your unworthy servant, the abundant waves of your accustomed clemency. For I must confesse, that I have so highly offended you, as but your goodnesse surpasse the malice of my conceites, I must remaine, and that right worthily, to the severe punishment of my deserts. And so should you but lose him who hath cast away himselfe, and neither can accuse you, nor dare to excuse himselfe of the crime. Dame Elinor, who had rather have found her servant perfectly revived, than thus with strange conceites encumbered, and musing much at his dark speech, became importunate to know the certainty of his thoughts. And Ferdinando, as one not master of himselfe, gan at the last plainly confesse how he had mistrusted the change of her vowed affections. Yea, and that was more, he plainly expressed with whom, of whom, by whom, and to whom she bent her better liking. Now here I would demaund of such as are expert, is there any greater impediment to the fruition of a lovers delights than to be mistrusted? Or rather, is it not the ready way to race all love and former good will out of remembrance? To tell a guilty mind that you do mistrust it? It should seeme yes, by Dame Elinor, who began now to take the matter hotly, and of such vehemency were her fancies, that she now fell into flat defiance with Ferdinando, who although he sought by many fair words to temper her cholerique passions, and by yielding himselfe to get the conquest of another, yet could he by no meanes determine the quarrel. The soft pillows being present at all these hot speeches, put forth themselves as mediators for a truce between these enemies, and desired that, if they would needs fight, it might be in their presence but one only blow, and so from thenceforth to become friends again for ever. But the Dame denied flatly, alledging that she found no cause at all to use such courtesie unto such a recreant, adding further many words of great reproach, the which did so enrage Ferdinando, as that having forgotten all former courtesies, Q1 has this, he drew upon his new professed enemy, and bare her up with such a violence against the bolster, that before she could prepare the ward, he thrust her through both hands, and &c. Whereby the Dame swooning for fear, was constrained for a time to abandon her body to the enemies courtesie. At last when she came to herselfe, she rose suddenly and determined to save herselfe by flight, leaving him in bed, with many despitefull words, and swearing that he should never eftsoons take her at the like advantage, the which oath she kept better than her former professed good will, and having now recovered her chamber, because she found her hurt to be nothing dangerous, I doubt not but she slept quietly the rest of the night, as Ferdinando also, persuading himself that he should with convenient leisure recover her from this haggard conceit, took some better rest towards the morning than he had done in many nights forepast. So let them both sleep, whiles I turn my pen unto the before named secretary, who being, as I say, come lately from Florence, had made many proffers to renew his accustomed consultations, but the sorrow which his mistress had conceived in Jeronimi his sickness, together with her continual repair to him during the same, had been such lets unto his attempts, as it was long time before he could obtain audience. At the last, these new accidents fell so favourably for the furtherance of his cause, that he came to his mistress' presence, and there pleaded for himself. Now if I should at large write his allegations, together with her subtle answers, I should but cumber your ears with unpleasant rehearsal of feminine frailty. To be short, the late disdainful mood which she had conceived against Ferdinando, together with a scruple which lay in her conscience, touching the 11th article of her belief, moved her presently with better will to consult with this secretary, as well upon the speedy revenge of her late received wrongs, as also upon the reformation of her religion. And in very deed it fell out that the secretary, having been of long time absent, and there his quills and pens not worn so near as they were wont to be, did now prick such fair large notes, that his mistress liked better to sing fa burden under him than to descant any longer upon Ferdinando's plain song, and thus they continued in good accord, until it fortuned that Dame Frances came into her chamber upon such sudden as she had like to have marred all the music. Well, they conveyed their cliffs as closely as they could, but yet not altogether without some suspicion given to the said Dame Frances, who although she could have been content to take any pain in Jeronimi's behalf, yet otherwise she could never have bestowed the watching about so worthless a prize. After womanly salutations, they fell into sudden discourses, the secretary still abiding in the chamber with them. At last 2 or 3 other gentlewomen of the castle came into Madame Elinor's chamber, who after their bonjour did all una voce seem to lament the sickness of Ferdinando, and called upon the dames Elinor and Frances to go visit him again. The Lady Frances courteously consented, but Madame Elinor first alleged that she herself was also sickly, the which she attributed to her late pains taken about him, and said, that only for that cause she was constrained to keep her bed longer than her accustomed hour. The dames, but specially the Lady Frances, gan straightways conjecture some great cause of sudden change, and so leaving Dame Elinor, walked all together into the park to take the air in the morning. And as they thus walked, it chanced that Dame Pergo heard a cuckoo chant, who because the pride of the spring was now past, cried cuck cuck cuckoo in her stammering voice. Aha, quod Pergo, this foul bird begins to fly the country, and yet before her departure, see how spitefully she can devise to salute us. Not so, quod Dame Frances, but some other whom she hath espied, wherewith Dame Pergo looking round about her, and espying none other company, said, Why here is nobody but we few women, quod she. Thanks be to God the house is not far from us, quod Dame Frances. Hereat the wily Pergo partly perceiving Dame Frances' meaning, replied on this sort, I understand you not, quod she, but to leap out of this matter, shall we go visit Master Jeronimi, and see how he doth this morning? Why, quod Dame Frances, do you suppose that the cuckoo called upon him? Nay, marry, quod Pergo, for as far as I know, he is not married. As who should say, quod Dame Frances, that the cuckoo envieth none but married folks? I take it so, said Pergo. The Lady Frances answered, Yes, sure, I have noted as evil luck in love, after the cuckoo's call, to have happened upon divers unmarried folks, as ever I did unto the married. But I can be well content that we go unto him, for I promised, on the behalf of us all, that we would use our best devoir to recomfort him until he had recovered health. And I do much marvel that the Lady Elinor is now become so unwilling to take any travail in his behalf, especially remembering that but yesternight she was so diligent to bring him to bed. But I perceive that all earthly things are subject unto change. Even so they be, quod Pergo. For you may behold the trees, which but even this other day were clad in gladsome green, and now their leaves begin to fade and change colour. Thus they passed, talking and walking, until they returned unto the castle, whereas they went straight unto Ferdinando's chamber, and found him in bed. Why, how now, Trust, quod Dame Frances, will it be no better? Yes, shortly, I hope, quod he. The ladies all saluted him, and he gave them the gramercy. At the last Pergo popped this question unto him, And how have you slept in your mistress' sheets, Master Jeronimi, quod she. Reasonably well, quod he. But I pray you, where is my mistress this morning? Marry, said Pergo, we left her in bed, scarce well at ease. I am the more sorry, quod he. Why, Trust, said Mistress Frances, be of good comfort, and assure yourself that here are others who would be as glad of your well-doing as your mistress in any respect. I ought not to doubt thereof, quod Ferdinando, having the proof that I have had of your great courtesies, but I thought it my duty to ask for my mistress being absent. Thus they passed some time with him until they were called away unto prayers, and that being finished, they went to dinner, where they met Dame Elinor attired in a nightkerchief after the solemnest fashion I should have said, who looked very drowsily upon the folks, unless it were her secretary, unto whom she deigned sometime to lend a friendly glance. The lord of the castle demanded of her how Master Jeronimi did this morning. She answered that she knew not, for she had not seen him that day. You may do well then, daughter, quod the lord, to go now unto him, and to assay if he will eat any thing, and if here be no meats that like him, I pray you command for him any thing that is in my house. You must pardon me, sir, quod she, I am sickly disposed, and would be loath to take the air. Why then you go, Mistress Frances, quod he, and take somebody with you, and I charge you see that he lack nothing. Mistress Frances was glad of the embassage, and arising from the table with one other gentlewoman, took with her a dish of chickens boiled in white broth, saying to her father, I think this meat meetest for Master Jeronimi, of any that is here. It is so, quod he, daughter, and if he like not that, cause somewhat else to be dressed for him according to his appetite. Thus she departed and came to Ferdinando, who being plunged in sundry woes, and thrilled with restless thoughts, was now beginning to rise, but seeing the dames, couched down again, and said unto them, Alas, fair ladies, you put yourselves to more paines than either I do desire or can deserve. Good Trust, quod Dame Frances, our paines are no greater than duty requireth, nor yet so great as we could vouchsafe in your behalf. And presently my father hath sent us unto you, quod she, with this pittance. And if your appetite desire any one thing more than other, we are to desire likewise that you will not refrain to call for it. O my good hope, quod he, I perceive that I shall not die as long as you may make me live. And being now some deal recomforted with the remembrance of his mistress' words, which she had used overnight at her first coming, and also thinking that although she parted in choler, it was but justly provoked by himself, and that at leisure he should find some salve for that sore also, he determined to take the comfort of his assured hope, and so to expel all venoms of mistrust before received. Wherefore, raising himself in his bed, he cast a nightgown about his shoulders, saying, it shall never be said that my fainting heart can reject the comfortable cordials of so friendly physicians. Now by my troth, well said, gentle trust, quod Dame Frances, and in so doing assure yourself garrison with speed. This thus said, the courteous dame become his carver, and he with a bold spirit gan taste of her cookery, but the late conflicts of his conceits had so disacquainted his stomach from repasts, that he could not well away with meat, and yet nevertheless by little and little received some nouriture. When his hope had crammed him as long as she could make him feed, they delivered the rest to the other gentlewoman, who having not dined, fell to her provender. In which meanwhile the Lady Frances had much comfortable speech with Signor Jeronimi, and declared that she perceived very well the malady. But my trust, quod she, be all whole, and remember what I foretold you in the beginning. Nevertheless, you must think that there are remedies for all mischiefs, and if you will be ruled by mine advice, we will soon find the mean to ease you of this mishap. Ferdinando took comfort in her discretion, and friendly kissed her hand, gave her a cartload of thanks for her great good will, promising to put to his uttermost force, and evermore to be ruled by her advice. Thus they passed the dinner, while the Lady Frances always refusing to declare her conceit of the late change which she perceived in his mistress, for she thought best first to win his will unto conformity by little and little, and then in the end to persuade him with necessity. When the other gentlewoman had victualled her, they departed, requiring him to rise and boldly to resist the faintness of his fever, the which he promised, and so bade them addio. The ladies at their return found the court in Dame Elinor's chamber, who had there assembled her secretary, Dame Pergo, and the rest. There they passed an hour or twain in sundry discourses, wherein Dame Pergo did always cast out some bone for Mistress Frances to gnaw upon, for that indeed she perceived her hearty affection towards Ferdinando, whereat Mistress Frances changed no countenance, but reserved her revenge until a better opportunity. At last quod Dame Frances unto Mistress Elinor, and when will you go unto your servant, fair lady? When he is sick, and I am whole, quod Dame Elinor. That is even now, quoth the other, for how sick he is yourself can witness, and how well you are, we must bear record. You may as well be deceived in my disposition, quod Dame Elinor, as I was overseen in his sudden alteration, and if he be sick, you are meet to be his physician, for you saw yesterday that my paines did little profit towards his recomfort. Yes, surely, said the other, not only I, but all the rest had occasion to judge that your courtesy was his chief comfort. Well, quod Dame Elinor, you know not what I know. Nor you what I think, quod Dame Frances. Think what you list, quod Elinor. Indeed, quod Frances, I may not think that you care, neither will I die for your displeasure. And so half angry she departed. At supper they met again, and the master of the house demanded of his daughter Frances how Ferdinando did. Sir, quod she, he did eat somewhat at dinner, and sithens I saw him not. The more to blame, quod he, and now I would have all you gentlewomen take of the best meates, and go sup with him, for company driveth away carefulness, and leave you me here with your leavings alone. Nay, sir, quod Mistress Elinor, I pray you give me leave to bear you company, for I dare not adventure thither. The lord of the castle was contented, and dispatched away the rest, who taking with them such viands as they thought meetest, went unto Jeronimi's chamber, finding him up, and walking about to recover strength, whereat Dame Frances rejoiced, and declared how her father had sent that company to attend him at supper. Ferdinando gave great thanks, and missing now nothing but his mistress, thought not good yet to ask for her, but because he partly guessed the cause of her absence, he contented himself, hoping that when his lure was new garnished, he should easily reclaim her from those coy conceits. They passed over their supper all in quiet, and soon after Mistress Frances, being desirous to requite Dame Pergo's quips, requested that they might continue the pastime which Dame Pergo had begun overnight, whereunto they all consented, and the lot fell unto Dame Frances to propound the second question, who addressing her speech unto Ferdinando, said in this wise: Noble Governor, I will rehearse unto you a strange history, not feigned, neither borrowed out of any old authority, but a thing done indeed of late days, and not far distant from this place where we now remain. It chanced that a gentleman our neighbour, being married to a very fair gentlewoman, lived with her by the space of 4 or 5 years in great contentation, trusting her no less than he loved her, and yet loving her as much as any man could love a woman. On that other side the gentlewoman had won unto her beauty a singular commendation for her chaste and modest behaviour. Yet it happened in time that a lusty young gentleman, who very often resorted to them, obtained that at her hands which never any man could before him attain, and to be plain, he won so much in her affections, that forgetting both her own duty and her husband's kindness, she yielded her body at the commandment of this lover, in which pastime they passed long time by their politic government. At last the friends of this lady, and especially 3 sisters which she had, espied overmuch familiarity between the 2 lovers, and dreading lest it might break out to their common reproach, took their sister apart, and declared that the world did judge scarce well of the repair of that gentleman unto her house, and that if she did not foresee it in time, she should not only lose the good credit which she herself had hitherto possessed, but furthermore should disdain their whole race with common obloquy and reproach. These and sundry other godly admonitions of these sisters could not sink in the mind of this gentlewoman, for she did not only stand in defiance what any man could think of her, but also seemed to accuse them, that because they saw her estimation, being their younger, to grow above their own, they had therefore devised this mean to set variance between her husband and her. The sisters, seeing their wholesome counsel so rejected, and her continue still in her obstinate opinion, addressed their speech unto her husband, declaring that the world judged not the best, neither they themselves did very well like of the familiarity between their sister and that gentleman, and therefore advised him to forecast all perils, and in time to forbid him his house. The husband, on the other side, had also conceived such a good opinion of his guest, and had grown into such a strict familiarity with him, that you might with more ease have removed a stone wall, than once to make him think amiss either of his wife or of her lover. Yea, and immediately after this conference, he would not stick thus to say unto his wife, Lamia, for so indeed was her name, thou hast 3 such busy-brained sisters, as I think shortly their heads will break. They would have me to be jealous of thee. No, no, Lamia, etc. So that he was not only far from any such belief, but furthermore did every day increase his courtesies towards the lover. The sisters being thus on all sides rejected, and yet perceiving more and more an unseemly behaviour between their sister and her minion, began to melt in their own grease, and such was their enraged pretence of revenge, that they suborned divers servants in the house to watch so diligently as that this treason might be discovered. Amongst the rest, one maid of subtle spirit had so long watched them, that at last she spied them go into the chamber together, and locked the door to them, whereupon she ran with all haste possible to her master, and told him that if he would come with her, she would show him a very strange sight. The gentleman, suspecting nothing, went with her, until he came into a chamber near unto that wherein they had shut themselves, and she, pointing her master to the keyhole, bade him look through, where he saw the thing which most might mislike him to behold, whereat he suddenly drew his dagger, and turned towards the maid, who fled from him for fear of mischief. But when he could not overtake her, in the heat of his choler, he commanded that she should forthwith truss up that little which she had, and to depart his service. And before her departure, he found means to talk with her, threatening that if ever she spake any word of this mystery in any place where she should come, it should cost her life. The maid for fear departed in silence, and the master never changed countenance to either his wife or to her paramour, but feigned unto his wife that he had turned away the maid upon that sudden, for that she had thrown a kitchen knife at him, whiles he went about to correct a fault in her, etc. Thus the good gentleman drank up his own sweat unseen every day, increasing courtesy to the lover, and never changing countenance to his wife in anything, but only that he refrained to have such knowledge of her carnally, as he in time past had, and other men have of their wives. In this sort he continued by the space almost of half a year, nevertheless lamenting his mishap in solitary places. At last, what moved him I know not, he fell again to company with his wife as other men do, and as I have heard it said, he used this policy. Every time that he had knowledge of her, he would leave either in the bed, or in her cushion cloth, or by her looking glass, or in some place where she must needs find it, a piece of money, which then was in Italy called a caroline. Thus he dealt with her continually by the space of 4 or 5 months, using her nevertheless very kindly in all other respects, and providing for her all things necessary at the first call. But unto his guest he still augmented his courtesy, in such sort that you would have thought them to be sworn brothers. All this notwithstanding, his wife, much musing at these small pieces which she found in this sort, and furthermore having sundry times found her husband in solitary places, making great lamentation, she grew inquisitive what should be the secret cause of these alterations, unto whom he would none otherwise answer, but that any man should find occasion to be more pensive at one time than at another. The wife notwithstanding, increasing her suspect, imparted the same unto her lover, alledging therewithal that she doubted very much lest her husband had some vehement suspicion of their affairs. The lover encouraged her, and likewise declared, that if she would be importunate to inquire the cause, her husband would not be able to keep it from her. And having now thoroughly instructed her, she dealt with her husband in this sort. One day, when she knew him to be in his study alone, she came in to him, and having fast locked the door after her, and conveyed the key into her pocket, she began first with earnest entreaty, and then with tears, to crave that he would no longer keep from her the cause of his sudden alteration. The husband dissimuled the matter still. At last she was so earnest to know for what cause he left money in such sort at sundry times, that he answered on this wise: Wife, quod he, thou knowest how long we have been married together, and how long I have made so dear account of thee as ever man made of his wife, since which days thou knowest also how long I refrained thy company, and how long again I have used thy company, leaving the money in this sort. And the cause is this: so long as thou didst behave thyself faithfully towards me, I never loathed thy company, but sithens I have perceived thee to be a harlot, and therefore did I for a time refrain, and forbear to lie with thee, and now I can no longer forbear it, I give thee every time that I lie with thee, a caroline, which is to make thee understand thine own whoredom, and this reward is sufficient for a whore. The wife began stoutly to stand at defiance, but the husband cut off her speech, and declared when, where, and how he had seen it. Hereat the woman being abashed, and finding her conscience guilty of as much as he had alledged, fell down on her knees, and with most bitter tears craved pardon, confessing her offence. Whereat her husband, moved with pity, and melting likewise in floods of lamentation, recomforted her, promising that if from that day forwards she would be true unto him, he would not only forgive all that was past, but become more tender and loving unto her than ever he was. Why do I tarry so long? They became of accord, and in full accomplishment thereof, the gentlewoman did altogether eschew the company, the speech, and as much as in her lay, the sight of her lover, although her husband did continue his courtesy towards him, and often charged his wife to make him fair resemblant. The lover was now only left in perplexity, who knew nothing what might be the cause of all these changes, and that most grieved him. He could by no means obtain again the speech of his desired. He watched all opportunities. He suborned messengers. He wrote letters, but all in vain. In the end, she caused to be declared unto him a time and place where she would meet him and speak with him. Being met, she put him in remembrance of all that had passed between them. She laid also before him how trusty she had been unto him in all professions. She confessed also how faithfully he had discharged the duty of a friend in all respects, and therewithal she declared that her late alteration and pensiveness of mind was not without great cause, for that she had of late such a mishap as might change the disposition of any living creature. Yea, and that the case was such, as unless she found present remedy, her death must needs ensue, and that speedily, for the preventing whereof, she alleged that she had beaten her brains with all devices possible, and that in the end she could think of no redress but one, the which lay only in him to accomplish. Wherefore she besought him, for all the love and good will which had ever passed between them, now to show the fruits of true friendship, and to gratify her with a free grant to this request. The lover, who had always been desirous to pleasure her in anything, but now especially to recover her wonted kindness, gan frankly promise to accomplish anything that might be to him possible, yea, though it were to his great detriment, and therewithal did deeply blame her in that she would so long torment herself with any grief, considering that it lay in him to help it. The lady answered, that she had so long kept it from his knowledge, because she doubted whether he would be content to perform it or not, although it was such a thing as he might easily grant without any manner of hurt to himself, and yet now in the end she was forced to adventure upon his courtesy, being no longer able to bear the burden of her grief. The lover solicited her most earnestly to disclose it, and she, as fast, seemed to mistrust that he would not accomplish it. In the end she took out a book, which she had brought for the nonce, and bound him by an oath to accomplish it. The lover, mistrusting nothing less than that ensued, took the oath willingly, which done, she declared all that had passed between her and her husband, his grief, her repentance, his pardon, her vow, and in the end of her tale enjoined the lover, that from thenceforwards he should never attempt to break her constant determination. The lover replied that this was impossible, but she plainly assured him, that if he granted her that request, she would be his friend in all honest and godly wise. If not, she put him out of doubt that she would eschew his company, and flee from his sight as from a scorpion. The lover, considering that her request was but just, accusing his own guilty conscience, remembering the great courtesies always used by her husband, and therewithal seeing the case now brought to such an issue, as that by no other means than by this it could be concealed from the knowledge of the world, but most of all, being urged by his oath, did at last give an unwilling consent, and yet a faithful promise to yield unto her will in all things. And thus being become of one assent, he remaineth the dearest friend and most welcome guest that may be, both to the lady and her husband, and the man and the wife so kind each to other, as if there never had been such a breach between them. Now of you, noble governor, I would fain learn, whether the perplexity of the husband when he looked in at the keyhole, or of the wife when she knew the cause why the carolines were so scattered, or of the lover when he knew what was his mistress' charge, was greater of the three. I might have put in also the troubled thoughts of the sisters and the maid, when they saw their good will rejected, but let these three suffice. Gentle Hope, quod Ferdinando, you have rehearsed, and that right eloquently, a notable tale, or rather a notable history, because you seem to affirm, that it was done indeed of late, and not far hence, wherein I note 5 especial points, that is, a marvellous patience in the husband, no less repentance in the wife, no small boldness of the maid, but much more rashness in the sisters, and last of all, a rare tractability in the lover. Nevertheless, to return unto your question, I think the husband's perplexity greatest, because his losses abounded above the rest, and his injuries were uncomparable. The Lady Frances did not seem to contrary him, but rather smiled in her sleeve at Dame Pergo, who had no less patience to hear the tale recited than the Lady Frances had pleasure in telling of it. By this time the sleeping hour approached, and the ladies prepared their departure, when as Mistress Frances said unto the Venetian, although per case I shall not do it so handsomely as your mistress, yet good trust, quod she, if you vouchsafe it, I can be content to trim up your bed in the best manner that I may, as one who would be as glad as she to procure your quiet rest. Ferdinando gave her great thanks, desiring her not to trouble herself, but to let his man alone with that charge. Thus they departed, and how all parties took rest that night I know not. But in the morning Ferdinando began to consider with himself, that he might lie long enough in his bed before his mistress would be appeased in her peevish conceits. Wherefore he arose, and being apparelled in his night-gown, took occasion to walk in the gallery near adjoining unto his mistress' chamber. But there might he walk long enough, ere his mistress would come to walk with him. When dinner time came, he went into the great chamber, whereas the lord of the castle saluted him, being joyful of his recovery. Jeronimi, giving due thanks, declared that his friendly entertainment, together with the great courtesy of the gentlewomen, was such as might revive a man although he were half dead. I would be loath, quoth the host, that any gentleman coming to me for good will should want any courtesy of entertainment that lieth in my power. When the meat was served to the table, the gentlewomen came in, all but Dame Elinor and Mistress Pergo, the which Ferdinando marked very well, and it did somewhat abate his appetite. After dinner his hope came unto him, and demanded of him how he would pass the day for his recreation, to whom he answered, even as it best pleased her. She devised to walk into the park, and so by little and little to acquaint himself with the air. He agreed, and they walked together, being accompanied with 1 or 2 other gentlewomen. And although there were now more cause that he should mistrust his mistress than ever he had before received, yet the vehement passions which he saw in her when she first came to visit him, and moreover the earnest words which she pronounced in his extremity, were such a refreshing to his mind, as that he determined no more to trouble himself with like conceits, concluding further, that if his mistress were not faulty, then had he committed a foul offence in needless jealousy, and that if she were faulty, especially with the secretary, then no persuasion could amend her, nor any passion help him, and this was the cause that enabled him after such passing pangs to abide the doubtful conclusion, and thus manfully and valiantly to repress faintness of his mind, nothing doubting but that he should have won his mistress to pardon his presumption, and lovingly to embrace his service in wonted manner. But he was far deceived, for she was now in another tune, the which Mistress Frances began partly to discover unto him as they walked together, for she burdened him that his malady proceeded only of a disquiet mind. And if it did so, my gentle Hope, quod he, what remedy? My good trust, quod she, none other but to plant quiet where disquiet began to grow. I have determined, quod he, but I must crave the help of your assured friendship. Thereof you may make account, quod she, but wherein? Ferdinando, walking apart with her, began to declare that there was some contention happened between his mistress and him. The lady told him that she was not ignorant thereof. Then he desired her to treat so much in the cause as they might eftsoons come to parley. Thereof I dare assure you, quod Mistress Frances, and at their return she led him into his mistress' chamber, whom they found lying on her bed, whether galled with any grief, or weary of the thing, which you wot of, I know not, but there she lay, unto whom Ferdinando gave 2 or 3 salutations before she seemed to mark him. At last, said the Lady Frances unto her, your servant hearing of your sickness hath adventured thus far into the air to see you. I thank him, quod Dame Elinor, and so lay still, refusing to give him any countenance, whereat he perceiving all the other gentlewomen fall to whispering, thought good boldly to plead his own case, and approaching the bed, began to enforce his unwilling mistress unto courtesy, wherein he used such vehemence as she could not well by any means refuse to talk with him. But what their talk was, I may not take upon me to tell you. Sufficeth this to be known, that in the end she pretended to pass over all old grudges, and thenceforth to pleasure him as occasion might serve, the which occasion was so long in happening, that in the end he, being now eftsoons troubled with unquiet fantasies, and forced to use his pen again as an ambassador between them, one day amongst the rest found opportunity to thrust a letter into her bosom, wherein he had earnestly requested another moonshine banquet, or Friday's breakfast, to recomfort his dulled spirits, whereunto the dame yielded this answer in writing, but of whose inditing judge you. I can but smile at your simplicity, who burden your friends with an impossibility. The case so stood as I could not, though I would. Wherefore, from henceforth, either learn to frame your request more reasonably, or else stand content with a flat repulse. She. Ferdinando liked this letter but a little, and being thereby driven unto his accustomed vein, he compiled in verse this answer following, upon these words contained in her letter, I could not though I would. I could not though I would, good lady, say not so, since one good word of your good will might soon redress my woe. Where would is free before, there could can never fail. For proof you see how galleys pass where ships can bear no sail. The weary mariner, where skies are overcast, by ready will doth guide his skill, and wins the haven at last. The pretty bird that sings with prick against her breast, doth make a virtue of her need to watch when others rest. And true the proverb is, which you have laid apart, there is no hap can seem too hard unto a willing heart. Then lovely lady mine, you say not as you should, in doubtful terms to answer thus, I could not though I would. Yes, yes, full well you know, your can is quick and good, and wilful will is eke too swift to shed my guiltless blood. But if good will were bent as prest as power is, such will would quickly find the skill to mend that is amiss. Wherefore if you desire to see my true love spilt, command, and I will slay myself, that yours may be the guilt. But if you have no power to say your servant nay, write thus, I may not as I would, yet must I as I may. Fernando Jeronimi. Thus Jeronimi replied upon his mistress' answer, hoping thereby to recover some favour at her hands, but it would not be, so that now he had been as likely as at the first, to have fretted in fantasies, had not the Lady Frances continually comforted him, and by little and little she drove such reason into his mind, that now he began to subdue his humour with discretion, and to determine that if he might espie evident proof of his mistress' frailty, he would then stand content with patience perforce, and give his mistress the beso las manos. And it happened one day amongst others, that he resorted to his mistress' chamber, and found her a lo solito, lying upon her bed, and the secretary with Dame Pergo and her handmaid keeping of her company, whereat Ferdinando somewhat repining, came to her and fell to dalliance, as one that had now rather adventure to be thought presumptuous, than yield to be accounted bashfull. He cast his arme over his mistress, and began to accuse her of sluggishness, using some other bold parts, as well to provoke her, as also to grieve the other. The lady seemed little to delight in his dallying, but cast a glance at her secretary, and therewith smiled, when as the secretary and Dame Pergo burst out into open laughter, the which Ferdinando perceiving, and disdaining her ingratitude, was forced to depart, and in that fantasy compiled this sonnet. With her in armes that had my heart in hold, I stood of late to plead for pity so, and as I did her lovely lookes behold, she cast a glance upon my rivall foe. His fleering face provoked her to smile, when my salt teares were drowned in disdaine. He glad, I sad, he laughd, alas the while, I wept for woe, I pined for deadly paine. And when I saw none other hoot prevaile, but reason rule must guide my skilfull mind, why then quod I, old proverbs never faile, for yet was never good cat out of kind, nor woman true, but even as stories tell, won with an egg and lost again with shell. Fernando Jeronimi. This sonnet declareth that he began now to account of her as she deserved, for it hath a sharp conclusion, and it is somewhat too general. Well, as it is, he lost it where his mistress found it, and she immediately imparted the same unto Dame Pergo, and Dame Pergo unto others, so that it quickly became common in the house. Amongst others, Mistress Frances having recovered a copy of it, did seeme to pardon the generality, and to be well pleased with the particularity thereof, the which she bewrayed one day unto Ferdinando in this wise. Of all the joyes that ever I had, my good trust, quod she, there is none wherein I take more comfort than in your conformity. And although your present rage is such that you can be content to condemn a number unknown, for the transgression of one too well known, yet I do rather rejoice that you should judge your pleasure over many, than to be abused by any. My good Hope, quod he, it were not reason that after such manifold proofs of your exceeding courtesie, I should use strange or contentious language with so dear a friend. And indeed I must confesse that the opinion which I have conceived of my mistress, hath stirred my pen to write very hardly against all the feminine gender. But I pray you pardon me, quod he, and if it please you, I will recant it, as also per case I was but cloyed with surquetry, and presumed to think more than may be proved. Yea, but how if it were proved, quod Dame Frances? If it were so, which God forbid, quod he, then could you not blame me to conceive that opinion. Howsoever I might blame you, quod she, I meane not to blame you, but I demand further, if it be as I think and you suspect, what will you then do? Surely, quod he, I have determined to drink up mine own sorrow secretly, and to bid them both adieu. I like your farewell better than your fantasy, quod she, and whensoever you can be content to take so much paines, as the knight, which had a night gowne guarded with naked swords, did take, I think you may put your selfe out of doubt of all these things. By these words, and other speech which she uttered unto him, Ferdinando smelt how the world went about, and therefore did one day in the grey morning adventure to passe through the gallery towards his Mistress' chamber, hoping to have found the door open, but he found the contrary, and there attending in good devotion, heard the parting of his Mistress and her secretary, with many kind words, whereby it appeared that the one was very loath to depart from the other. Poor Jeronimi was enforced to bear this burden, and after he had attended there as long as the light would give him leave, he departed also to his chamber, and appareling himself, could not be quiet until he had spoken with his Mistress, whom he burdened flatly with this despiteful treachery, and she as fast denied it, until at last being still urged with such evident tokens as he alledged, she gave him this bone to gnaw upon. And if I did so, quod she, what then? Whereunto Ferdinando made none answer, but departed with this farewell. My losse is mine owne, and your gaine is none of yours, and sooner can I recover my losse, than you enjoy the gaine which you gape after. And when he was in place solitary, he compiled these following for a finall end of the matter. And if I did, what then? Are you aggrieved therefore? The sea hath fish for every man, and what would you have more? Thus did my Mistress once amaze my mind with doubt, and popped a question for the nonce to beat my braines about, whereto I thus replied, each fisherman can wish that all the seas at every tide were his alone to fish, and so did I in vaine, but since it may not be, let such fish there as find the gaine, and leave the losse for me. And with such luck and losse, I will content my selfe, till tides of turning time may tosse such fishers on the shelfe, and when they stick on sands, that every man may see, then will I laugh and clap my hands, as they do now at me. Fernando Jeronimi. Thus Ferdinando, being no longer able to bear these extreme despites, resolved to absent himself, as well for his own further quiet, as also to avoid the occasion of greater mischiefs that might ensue. And although the exceeding courtesies and approved fidelity of Dame Fraunces had been sufficient to allure the fast liking of any man, especially considering that she was reasonably fair, and descended of a worthy father, who now fell flatly to move and solicite the same, yet such sinister conceits had he taken by the frailty of Dame Elinor, as that rejecting all proffers, and condemning all courtesies, he took his leave, and without pretence of return, departed to his house in Venice, spending there the rest of his days in a dissolute kind of life, and abandoning the worthy Lady Francesina, who daily being galled with the griefe of his great ingratitude, did shortly bring herself into a miserable consumption, whereof after 3 years languishing, she died. Notwithstanding all which occurrences, the Lady Elinor lived long in the continuance of her accustomed change, and thus we see, that where wicked lust doth bear the name of love, it doth not only infect the light-minded, but it may also become confusion to others which are vowed to constancy. And to that end I have recited this fable, which may serve as example to warn the youthful reader from attempting the like worthless enterprise. I know not how my rude translation thereof will delight the finest judgments, but sure as Bartello writeth it in Italian, it is both pleasant and profitable, the which hath made me adventure thus to publish the same in such simple style as I am able to indite, desiring the gentle reader rather to take example of reformation therein, than to find fault at the homely handling of the same. Ever or never. End of page 8. End of the Adventures of Master F.J. by George Gascoigne.